The young man fell to the ground with a crash after drinking tea with poison. The young lady in turn looked at him intently. She did not show any emotion. As she left, she ordered the knights to deal with the crown prince, and the knights obeyed her order. For the sake of her beloved lover, she committed a sinful act. She slowly went to him. She was puzzled since on his orders, she had betrayed the kingdom. The young lady in turn wondered if he was happy now. She understood that now he would become the next king. She wondered if he would love her even more now. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked how everything went. She looked around the hall in horror, and a moment later said that she had dealt with her crown prince. A moment later, the prince laughed wildly throughout the hall. He was very pleased with the lady's actions. He looked closely at Ariadne and said with a grin that she had tried well. The lady looked at him embarrassed. He looked at her with a satisfied smile and said that now their time had come. He looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile. She waited to see what he would say. He hugged her tenderly and said that as soon as everything calmed down, he would make her the most noble woman in the entire kingdom. She looked at the prince with a smile on her face and called him. She was very happy because this was exactly what her heart desired. She knew that if only he was happy, she was happy with him, and she was ready to do anything to be with him. 9 years have passed since Cesare successfully staged a coup d'etat and became regent of the kingdom. All these years, she was by his side, playing the role of the one who managed the internal affairs of the palace. The young lady, in turn, diligently carried out everything that the former queen had done. Since then, she waited patiently for him every time, hoping that he would soon do what he said. 8 years ago, the lady debated whether Ariada would become the regent's wife, as she had grown up on a farm and was uneducated. They said that the fact that a girl like her was in the palace as a representative of the capital's aristocracy was considered a disgrace. The lady looked at those present and asked how even the gentleman planned to get married. Another lady mockingly asked whom he should marry. They did not take the current bride seriously. They said mockingly that of course he shouldn't marry her because it was wrong. They said that he could not do this because she was an illegitimate child. Ariadne, in turn, knew that he loved her. The ladies discussed the new rumors that were circulating in the kingdom. They mockingly said that the regent was also an illegitimate son. The young lady froze in place from what she heard. They said that the story was about the crown prince's cousin Obman because they were half-brothers. The madam mockingly said that such illegitimate children would not receive God's blessing since they were only the fruits of a dirty union. They said he was unfit to be king given his unclean origins. The young lady, in turn, was not going to tolerate this. She grabbed the madame by the hair in anger. She screamed furiously at her to insult her rather than Cesare. Ariadne screamed furiously at madame not to dare to speak so vilely about him. Cesare walked slowly into the room and froze in shock. He looked at them intently and asked what was going on. The young lady, in turn, blossomed before our eyes and looked at her lover with a joyful smile. The young man froze in shock. He saw what she had done to the countess. Her expression changed because he had not addressed her. He slowly approached the countess and asked if everything was all right with her. Cesare looked at her intently and said that he would help her up. Madame said that the regent had been taught manners, unlike that girl. The young lady looked at them with fury. She did not understand why he did not approach her first. She looked intently at her lover, as she did not understand why he did this. A moment later, he slowly approached her. She froze in place and stared at him. He pulled her towards him angrily and said that this was not the way to behave with the ladies of the capital. He shouted that he needed the support of the aristocrats. He looked at the lady with fury and said that the countess was of more use than someone like her. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock. She did not expect to hear such a thing from him. He looked at her with fury and asked if it was possible to allow someone who behaved so rudely to take the place of the regent's wife. As he left, he said that he had told her that she should become a kind and modest lady who would not be ashamed to present to society. All this time, she tried to comply with this condition in order to achieve what she wanted, but more than 8 years have passed. She was puzzled, as she was still his fiancée and nothing more. Cesare looked at the lady intently and said that he was a magnanimous ruler. He said with a grin that for this reason, he would take over the power of the deposed crown prince. She asked him not to touch her now. Cesare kissed her and told her to behave decently. She knew that she needed to try a little more, and then he would definitely marry her. She sighed heavily, for this was the only reason she could endure all this. He looked at her intently and said that after thinking for a while, he had decided on something. Bathing in the arms of the young lady, he said that he wanted to make Isabella his queen. She froze in shock. She said with fury that her sister was Alfonso's wife. She shouted that marriage with an invalid widow was blasphemy. He said that this was not true, since she had remained chaste throughout their marriage. He asked if she really wanted her sister to spend the rest of her life in a convent. The young lady was in shock and shouted to the prince that her sister was no longer a virgin, as she had miscarried the crown prince's child. He shouted angrily that the enemies of women are women, but apparently, even among sisters, this rule is no exception. He pushed her away angrily and said that they were still vile creatures. The young lady in turn froze in shock. She did not expect to hear anything like that from him. She grabbed his clothes and screamed that he himself told her that he loved her. She screamed that he himself told her that he would take her as his wife. Ariadne pounced on him and shouted that he himself told her that they would always be together. He looked at her intently, but did not answer. She silently burst into tears looking at her lover. He sighed heavily and said that it was obvious that she really was a stupid woman and was only getting in his way. He sighed heavily and said that she was no match for the noble Isabella. Ariadne froze in shock. She simply could not believe that he could do this to her. She looked at him furiously and asked if he had been planning this since the crown prince was alive. He laughed, but a moment later said with fury that Isabella had been his from the very beginning. He looked at her mockingly and said that the strongest man needs the strongest and most beautiful woman. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately her father had foisted her on him instead of Isabella. He said that it was very humiliating. He looked at the young lady with fury and shouted that she was just pathetic. Ariadne was in shock. She did not expect to hear anything like this from helplessness. She plopped down on the ground. Crying on the ground, she asked him if she was just a replacement. Cesare looked at her mockingly and said that she was not even worthy of being a replacement. The young lady froze in shock, taken aback by his words. Trembling, she looked at him and shouted that she had even participated in the coup d'etat for his sake. She screamed that she had lost her finger for him. She looked at him with fury and shouted that her reputation, her marriage, her life were all for him. She cried out with blazing anger and fury that she had thrown all this at his feet. A moment later, there was a dead silence in the room as they stared at each other. He was furious because he knew perfectly well that she was right, but he still didn't want to have anything to do with her anymore. A moment later, he called the servant and said that it seemed that the miss had completely gone mad. He glanced sideways at the young lady and said that he would lock her in the western tower. Ariadne was furious and shocked. She screamed and called him, but it was all in vain. The young lady was walking leisurely through the garden with her lover. She was glad that he was next to her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that those lilies of the valley on the side of the road were so humble in their bow. He smiled and said that only he was able to see her in them. She froze in embarrassment. The young lady looked at her lover with a radiant smile and called him. The young lady in turn lay quietly and in despair in the dark, damp dungeon. Opening her eyes, she hoped that it was just a dream, and that soon everything would be as before. She sighed heavily, because she knew that today was the day of the coronation. She heard the song that she had prepared herself for this day. She knew that he would be at the ceremony that she had prepared. She did it all only for her love. She knew that if he had kept his word, she would be next to him now. A moment later, she heard someone's voice and sat up. The young lady looked closely at her sister and asked with a smile if she had slept well. She was shocked, as she did not expect to see Isabella now. She looked at her sister with fury and asked how she got here. She angrily asked her sister what kind of relationship she had with Cesare. Isabella looked at her with the most innocent face and asked how she dared to speak so brazenly about her husband. The young lady froze in shock. She had not expected to hear anything like that. Ariadne told her sister that if she was angry with her because of Crown Prince Alfonso, then she apologized. Isabella looked at her in surprise. A moment later, she told her sister with a grin that she was not angry at all, and that she was talking about her husband Cesare. The young lady was taken aback and looked at her sister in surprise, asking what she was talking about. Isabella asked her sister with a smile if she didn't think the status of the most noble woman in the kingdom was created especially for her. Isabella asked her sister how she dared to intend to become queen leaving her sister behind. She said that she should have given up this idea and stepped aside. Isabella told her sister that she had blackened her name by calling her an indecent widow who had an unborn child. She asked if she was willing to take responsibility. The lady looked at her sister with fury and asked if this was the reason for her anger. She angrily asked her sister how her late husband was, since he had been sincere and kind to her. Isabella looked at her sister in bewilderment and asked if all men weren't kind to her. She sighed heavily and said that if she responded to everyone's feelings, she would become famous as a prostitute, giving away her body and love. She looked at her sister with a grin. Ariadne asked her sister if she really loved Cesare. She screamed that they should have gotten engaged from the very beginning many years ago. Ariadne screamed at her sister that it was she who gave her this marriage. She looked at her sister with fury and asked why she had only just arrived now. Isabella thought for a moment and said that in those days he was just a simple count, but now everything had changed a lot. She looked at her sister with a smirk and said that after today's coronation, he would receive full power over the throne. She said with a grin that of course she regretted Alfonso's death, but he could not make her his queen. She looked closely at her sister and said with a smirk that this was more than enough reason for his death. Ariadne was in shock. Isabella said that she wants to take a place next to the ruler of the state, and Cesare is able to give her what she wants. She smiled softly and said that he had paid a price worthy of him to receive her in return. The young lady was shocked by what she heard, as she knew that he was everything to her. She was shocked because he was the one she valued even more than herself. She looked at her sister intently and said that she did not love him at all, and she separated them for her own whim. Ariadne screamed and asked her sister if she had really done this just to gain status and take the throne. Isabella looked at her sister with a smile. She was mocking her. A moment later, a dead silence hung between them. Ariadne realized everything she had heard. But a few minutes later, Isabella burst into hysterical laughter. She looked closely at her sister and said with a smirk that it was he who came to her and started begging. She said that he promised to give her status if only she would be by his side. Isabella smiled and said that he never forgot about her, and he said that when he hugged Ariadne, he imagined her. She said that because of her large frame, he felt as if he was hugging a man. Her hair was so black like a raven's. He told her that she was so sweet and delicate, that she was perfect for his embrace. He told her that she looked like an angel. Isabella looked at her sister mockingly and asked if she had ever been the object of someone's such passionate desire. The young lady in turn froze in place with rage. Memories of how he had behaved towards her suddenly came flooding back to her. Isabella in turn looked at her sister with a smile. She said that she even risked her life and dedicated herself to a man. She mockingly told her sister that she had received nothing in return. Isabella said they didn't know what gratitude was. She said they weren't to be trusted at all. She looked at her sister closely and said with a smile that they were simply getting what they wanted for the right price. The young lady was shocked and screamed that her lover was not like that. Isabella looked at her sister intently but said nothing. A moment later, she said that he was simply madly in love with her. Isabella shouted that eventually he would get tired of her and then he would remember Ariadne. She said mockingly that he would then remember her, that she had been devoted to him for 14 years. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to worry about the future. She looked at her sister with a radiant smile and said that for this reason it would not hurt her. She pierced her with her sword through and through and said with a smile that she could not come to hurt her precious sister. Ariadne was furious because she knew it was unfair since her sacrifice was not returned to her with his love. She was confused and didn't know where she had gone wrong or what had gone wrong. She knew that if she had gone back, she would have done everything differently. There is a golden rule: sinful deeds will be punished, and good deeds will be rewarded. Opening her eyes, she froze in shock as she found herself in the place where she lived as a child. She saw small hands that belonged to her. With the speed of lightning, the young lady rushed to the mirror. She froze as she saw that she had become a child again. She was surprised because she realized that she had gone back in time. She looked at her reflection in surprise, as she did not understand where the birthmark came from. Madame came closer to me and called out angrily. Madame looked at her with fury and asked if she really considered herself a noble maiden. Madame did not skimp on insulting the girl. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this time she had to protect herself. She looked at Madame with fury, for she knew that she would not allow herself to be neglected any longer. She turned to fight back, but a moment later, another woman ran up to them and called out to her. The Madame looked closely at the young lady and said with alarm that it would turn out that she would soon be taken away. The young lady in turn thought for a moment, since today was the very day when her father would bring her home. Cardinal de Marais, who like other clergy of that era, took holy orders, had a wife and children. However, in his capacity as a cardinal, he could not afford a legal wife. Lucretia, who was born an aristocrat, remained with him in the status of his mistress. But she behaved like his legal wife. They had 3 illegitimate children, who were treated as if they were born in wedlock. Among them, the second child was Isabella. Father valued her more than anyone else, for it was she who was sung by the yawds about her unchanging beauty and greatness. On the other hand, there was a girl born to a cardinal by a maid. Ariadne, being the child of a servant due to her ignoble origins, was expelled from her home to live on the farms where she grew up. A moment later, the servant informed the cardinal that he had brought his daughter. The young lady, in turn, slowly entered the room, where everyone was already waiting for her. The cardinal, in turn, looked intently at the young lady. Ariadne looked at her father with a smile, but he did not reciprocate her feelings. She bowed with a smile and said that she was very glad that he was in good health and that she was immensely happy to meet him for the first time in a long time. He looked at her intently, and a moment later said that the journey here had been difficult for her. He said that she didn't have the opportunity to get a good education, but she still grew up smart, and that's good. She said that she promised him that she would work hard and study more in order to bring glory to their house and not be disgraced in front of her father. Lucretia scornfully told her to try harder. She said that a woman's dignity does not lie in learning and improving. She told the girl to stop messing around and behave like a real woman. The young lady looked at her intently, as she had once considered her to be the perfect representative of the aristocracy, but now she realized that this was absurd. In the presence of a father who valued harmony in the family, it was very easy to fall for the trick. She bowed and said that she would try her best to live up to their expectations. She called her madam with a smirk, and the young lady in turn expected a response. Lucretia froze in shock. She didn't expect to hear something like that. The cardinal looked at his wife in surprise, as he understood that his daughter should not address her in that way. She looked at the young lady and said that she was not her madam. Lucretia grinned and told the lady to call her mom. Ariadne, with a cheerful smile, thanked her for being generous and allowing her to call her mother. A moment later, a young lady entered their office and apologized for the wait. Ariadne froze in shock. She did not expect to hear a painfully familiar voice. The young lady looked at her sister with a smile and greeted her, and she also said that she was very glad to see her in their family. Ariadne in turn stood and trembled. She turned pale from her sister's voice. Isabella smiled and told her sister that if she had any questions or needed help, she could contact her. The young lady in turn was taken aback, and her face turned pale. She was not ready to meet her. She knew she had to pull herself together quickly and not show her weaknesses. She always thought her sister was beautiful and perfect, heavenly light. She always wanted to be closer to her sister, so she always followed in her footsteps. She was puzzled because she now understood perfectly well that she was gradually fading in its shadow, feeling depressed. She knew that all this led to the fact that with the same bright smile on her face, she plunged the sword into her back. Ariadne understood perfectly well that now she would not live to please others, as in her past life. Isabella looked at the young lady in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was behaving in such a way. She smiled and extended her hand, saying that they were family, and the lady could call her sister. Ariadne's expression quickly changed, and she thanked her sister with a radiant smile. The cardinal looked at them with a smile, and said that, looking at how friendly they all were, he was immensely happy. All those present looked intently at the cardinal, showing no emotion. The madam looked at the lady with fury, and told her not to even dare to create problems for them. Ariadne sighed heavily, as she had done nothing of the sort. She sighed heavily, as she knew it was time for her to begin her planned move. The young lady looked at her with fury and shouted that she would never acknowledge her. She shouted that she simply did not believe that she was her sister. She screamed that the girl grew up on a farm as a commoner. She said that Ariadne was born from exactly the same servant. Ariadne knew that before in such situations, she would not have allowed herself to open her mouth, but now she knew how to calm her sister. She came closer to the girl and said that she was very sorry. The lady looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Ariadne smiled and said that apparently her mother and father were paying attention only to Isabella. The young lady in turn froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she looked at Ariadne with fury and asked what she knew. She screamed that the girl didn't know at all. She pushed Ariadne away with fury. A moment later, the young lady froze in place in shock, as she did not expect such a thing to happen. At the same time, Isabella sat on the stairs, shocked by what was happening. When the young lady wanted to push Ariadne away, she accidentally pushed her sister, and she fell to the ground with a crash. Ariadne sighed heavily, because she knew that something bad was about to happen. She looked at the little girl with a smile. The cardinal came out into the corridor in a rage. He was confused and did not understand where the noise was coming from. He did not understand what had happened and who was to blame. The young lady, trembling with fear, looked at her father and said that she did not mean it at all. A moment later, she shouted that Ariadne had done all this. The cardinal was shocked. He shouted to his daughter that she had just returned to her family and was already cooking something like this. The young lady in turn looked at Ariadne with a grin. She was glad that her father believed her. Ariadne told her father that she was very sorry for the inconvenience she had caused everyone, but that dear sister Isabella had suffered in trying to help her. The young lady in turn froze in shock as she did not understand what her sister was talking about. Ariadne sighed heavily and told her father that she was very sorry that she fell down the stairs. She said that Arabella got carried away and just wanted to push her. The cardinal froze in shock, looked intently at his daughter, and asked what she was talking about. Arabella was in shock and screamed that nothing like that had happened. Arabella screamed that Sister Isabella had no intention of helping her. She was just there. Ariadne said that despite the lack of proper education, she had no right to lie to her father. She looked at her father intently and said that if he didn't believe her, he could ask Isabella. Isabella in turn froze in surprise, and she did not know what to answer. Everyone looked at Isabella intently, waiting to hear what she would say. Ariadne looked at her sister intently, as she wanted her to answer, as she usually did. Ariadne was confident that her sister would do everything as needed. Isabella looked at her father closely, and said with a radiant smile that Arabella had just been playing around with them a little too much. She asked her father not to scold her little sister. Ariadne looked at her intently, as it was expected. She understood perfectly well that Isabella simply could not miss her chance, which would allow her to present herself as the ideal sister in the eyes of her father. Arabella was shocked. She ran to her sister and called her. Isabella looked at her sister with a smile and said that everyone has the right to make mistakes. She asked Arabella to be more careful next time. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect anything like this to happen. The cardinal shouted to his daughter that she was forbidden to leave her room for the next 2 weeks, and that she would pray and eat bread and water. Arabella was shocked. She ran to her father and shouted that she had not done anything like that. He looked at her with anger and said that it seemed that she had forgotten about repentance. He extended her punishment to 3 weeks. Arabella was in shock. She screamed and called for her father, but it was all in vain. As he was leaving, the cardinal called his wife. He was furious because he did not know where she was now. Arabella in turn shouted after her father that she was not at all to blame. The young lady looked intently at her sister. Meanwhile, the cardinal shouted at his wife that she was teaching their children incorrectly. She looked at everyone with a satisfied smile. Since everything turned out even better than she expected, she knew that this was only the beginning. The young lady looked at her father intently and said that she did not want to marry him at all, as he was an illegitimate child. She said her father always said that only she had the power to bring glory to their family's good name. She looked at her father intently and said that being a simple countess, she could not become the most noble in the kingdom. The cardinal sighed heavily and said that he knew this despite the fact that he was called the prince's cousin. He sighed heavily and said that the count was still the king's bastard. He said that he also did not want to marry his daughter off to some bastard. The madam looked at her daughter with a smile, as she was glad that her husband agreed with them. She looked intently at her husband and said that his mate should be another illegitimate woman. She said with a smile that that's why they should take a closer look at Ariadne. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that the girl was born from his carnal pleasure. With her maid, perhaps now her mother is forgotten by everyone and runs a farm. The cardinal thought for a moment, but a few minutes later, he said with a grin that this was a very good option. The young lady thought for a moment, for she knew that if everything went on as before, it meant that she had been called to this house for only one reason. She sighed heavily, knowing that she could not repeat the mistakes of the past. She was puzzled and did not know how best to act in this situation. She wondered how to avoid an engagement to Cesare. She wondered whether she should marry someone else or earn money and run away. She knew that her family would not allow her to marry of her own free will, and she could not get rich, since this is only possible for aristocratic men. She knew she wouldn't have a nice ending where he loved her. She understood perfectly well that they would not be happy together for the rest of their days. She knew that now she would not naively dwell on stupid fantasies. She really wanted him to pay for all his sins. A moment later, a maid entered her room and opened the door with a bang. Passing by the lady, she said that she had brought her clothes. She knew that this servant was Isabella's henchman. She looked at the lady with disdain and told her to change her clothes and go to dinner. Ariadne asked the maid if she really had a lot of work. Maleta said that it was exactly like that. The lady asked if she would help her change her clothes. Maleta looked at the lady with a smirk, and a moment later said that she was not a child. She asked if the lady could not handle it herself. Maleta said with disdain that she used to change her clothes on her own every day on the farm. As she was leaving, she quietly said that the girl had only just arrived and was already pretending to be a mistress. The young lady jerked the maid away with lightning speed and slapped her angrily across the face. She looked at the maid with fury and said that she should know her place so as not to allow such behavior in the future. The maid was in shock. Her cheek hurt from the blow. The maid looked at the young lady with fury and shouted that she too was born a servant. Maleta asked Ariadne angrily if that didn't mean they were on the same level. She shouted that, frankly speaking, the cardinal had risen to a high position, despite being an orphan, so the lady was not even half an aristocrat. She looked at the lady with disdain and said that if the cardinal took a liking to her tomorrow, she could easily give him the same child. The young lady in turn did not tolerate this. She struck the maid again with rage, and she fell to the ground with a crash. Ariadne looked at the maid and said that she would still pay for her mistake and for insulting her father. She looked at her with fury and told her to watch her language from now on. Ariadne told the maid to leave the room immediately. The maid was shocked. She didn't expect this. A moment later, she ran out of the room in a hurry. The lady in turn understood perfectly well that there was meaning in the maid's words. She knew that everything depended only on her father. She no longer wanted to make the mistake of trusting her life to one man. She knew that she needed an assistant in order to become stronger. A moment later, they burst into her room. Lucretia called out to the young lady with fury. She looked at the girl with fury and asked how she dared to raise her hand against their maid. The maid said that she was laying out her clothes when she suddenly raised her hand to her. The madam was furious and shouted that this was simply an atrocity. She shouted that the girl simply had a disgusting nature. The young lady in turn bowed low and called her mother. She sighed heavily and said that the maid had insulted her and her father behind her back, and she had no choice but to show her her place. The madam looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was talking about. Ariadne said that the maid told her that her father, without shame, raised all the illegitimate children as heirs to the aristocracy. The maid was taken aback and, looking at Madame, said that everything was not like that at all. She shouted that they were all of noble blood, and she did not dare to say such a thing. Ariadne said that the maid disrespected her father as a commoner. She said that her sisters were of noble birth, having inherited their mother's blood, and that she did not need to be served since she was born to a maid. She knew that, although Madame was pleased to hear such speeches, she would not ignore them. Ariadne said that the maid added something else. She said that if her father liked her and gave birth to his child, then he would be of the same status as her. She said that the maid said that, for this reason, she could treat her as she pleased. Lucretia was furious. She angrily grabbed the maid by the hair and asked how she dared to look at a strange man. She said that she would get a flogging. The maid was shocked. She asked the madame to believe her. Madame looked at I and said that if she found herself in such a situation again, she should immediately tell her everything. She looked at her and said that you can't hit a servant without warning. The young lady bowed and asked Madame's forgiveness, as she had not thought. She said that as a sign of repentance, they should allow her to go to the Rambai charity home for a few days. Madame was shocked. She did not expect to hear such a thing at all. Lady smiled and asked to let the maid go with her. She smiled and said that because of her ignorance, she was unable to take the true path, and she would take her with her and convert her to religion. The lady looked at the girl in surprise and said that, although she was right, that place was very nasty. Isabella looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she would like to go away for 5 days. Isabella smiled and said that the longer she was there, the more deeply she would understand all her guilt. The young lady said with a smile that her sister was right, and she would better go there for 5 days. Some time later, they finally arrived at the place. The young lady in turn froze in shock. When she saw the terrible picture, the maid trembled with fear. She looked closely at the Rambai charity house. She sighed heavily and looked around carefully, as everything was as she had expected. She looked at everyone present with a smirk, as she knew that this place would suit her plan perfectly. Ranbule Charity House to help the poor. But the allocated budget to help everyone in need was of course not enough. For this reason, they simply began to die due to lack of funds. The young lady glanced sideways at the maid as she was more agitated. A moment later, she called the maid, who flinched and looked at her intently. She smiled and said that for the next few days, it would be just the two of them here, and Sister Isabella would not be able to help them. She told the maid that if she had stood up for her when her mother ordered her to be flogged, she might have escaped the punishment. Ariadne looked at the maid with a grin and said that she was just a poor thing. The maid turned away from the young lady in anger. She said nothing to her. The young lady in turn looked intently at the maid. She knew that they needed to go to where all the dispossessed gathered. The reason the maid was next to her now was because she wanted to completely subjugate her. She looked closely at everyone present, as she thought that this place would be perfect. She learned that poor people who were dying gathered here. She knew that they would definitely spend time here. A moment later, the little girl called out to her sister. The young lady froze in surprise, and the maid trembled with fear. The lady turned around and looked intently at the maid. She asked if she saw. The maid looked at the lady in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She came closer to her and asked if she could see the little girl with fiery hair. The maid asked the lady what she meant by that. She came closer to her and quietly whispered in her ear, with a grin, that this was her sister. Ariadne told the maid that if she did not listen to her, she would leave her here. She said with a grin that then she and her sister would die here in agony. The maid, trembling with fear, said that she did not understand at all what the lady was talking about. She said that she had already admitted her guilt. Ariadne saw that the maid was very scared. She asked the maid if she really thought she was lying. She looked at the maid with cold fury and told her to answer her immediately. She touched her fury to her face. The lady looked closely at the young girls and said that she could only take one person with her. She looked closely at the girls and asked which of the two was smarter and more diligent. The girl looked at the lady and said that they had grown up together since childhood. She said that she promised to work hard, but asked to take them both. Her sister looked at her with fury, as she knew she had to get out of this place. She quickly pushed her away. She looked at the lady with a smirk and said that if there could only be one person there, it should be her. Then, her sister is capable of stealing, and her hands are shaking, which means she won't be able to work. Isabella looked at the girl with a grin and said that she had big ambitions. She said that she had made her choice. Maleta smiled and said that she would try very hard. Sancha looked at her sister in surprise. Maleta spoke furiously about her sister to sit quietly. She said that she would get her out as soon as she earned some money. She screamed that if even one of their family members got through, they would be able to help someone else, and so she should just wait for her. Sancha was shocked. She didn't expect that sister would act like this. She shouted after her, but it was all in vain. The young lady in turn froze in shock. The maid called out to her mistress in surprise. She walked up to the lady in a hurry and asked if she was okay, as for a moment, she seemed to be dumbfounded. Ariadne was in shock and did not understand what she had just seen. She wondered if this was the sister's past. She was furious because she knew she had to check it out. She walked towards the girl, but the maid screamed and called for her mistress. Sancha looked at Maleta in surprise and asked if it was she. The young lady came closer to the girl and asked how she was feeling. Sancha looked at the lady and asked what she was talking about. The young lady looked at her intently and said that she had to answer one question. She asked the girl if she had a sister who worked as a servant in the house of an aristocrat. Sancha nodded in response. The lady looked at her and asked if she said that if she achieved something, she would help someone else. Sancha was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise. She did not understand where she had learned such information. The young lady froze in shock as she realized that what she had seen was true. The young lady rose slowly and thanked the girl for her answer. She told her that she very much hoped that she would get better. Sancha was in shock and shouted at the young lady to wait. She asked the young lady for permission to have one conversation with her sister. The girl said that after her sister left for a rich house, they never saw each other again. The lady looked at the girl with fury and asked if she really meant to say that during all this time, her sister had never contacted her. She said that it was exactly like that, and that today was the first time they had met, and she was grateful that sister was here now to meet her. The lady looked at the girl and asked if her sister had never helped her. Sancha was taken aback and froze in place. Ariadne looked closely at the girl. She could clearly see the deplorable state the girl was in. A moment later, she called her maid, who turned pale in face. She looked at the maid with fury and asked if she didn't know the girl. The maid hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she said that she didn't need it at all. Sancha froze in shock after her sister's words. A moment later, she grabbed hold of the young lady's dress and asked for help. She prayed and asked for forgiveness and help. She asked to take her away from this place. The young lady looked closely at her maid and called her, while the girl continued to beg for help. The lady told her maid to call one of the caretakers to them. The young lady sighed heavily and finally sat down to rest. She was very puzzled because she was hungry. She looked closely at the caretaker and told him to give the girl some more food. He looked at her intently and said that although she was his lordship's daughter, they could not treat the poor in a special way. She looked at him intently and said that she understood everything she said, that in that case, she would give her her food for today. She wanted to help her only once, but it was already the third day. She wondered for a moment what she had seen then. She was surprised because it seemed to her that she saw the memories of her servant. After that, she touched her again, but nothing else happened. She thought that it didn't always depend on touch. She was puzzled and didn't know what kind of gift she had. A moment later, she saw a beautiful and large apple in front of her. She looked in surprise at the young man who offered her an apple and froze in shock. She was puzzled because she saw Alfonso in front of her. He asked her with a radiant smile if she would like an apple. She was puzzled because she knew that he was the very man whom she had pushed to death with her own hands. She accepted the gift with a smile, for she knew that she had returned to the time when she had not yet sinned. The young lady looked closely at the beautiful apple and thanked the prince. She slowly began to eat. She knew perfectly well that this was her chance for a new life. She sighed heavily and glanced sideways at the prince, as she had not expected to meet him at all. She knew that she would never again have the chance to meet the prince in person. She looked at the prince intently and with an innocent smile said that she had been hungry for several days, but thanks to him, she had a little snack. He looked at her in surprise and said that he heard that she gave her food to a sick child. The young lady timidly told the prince that he was right. Ariadne was nervous and wondered what to talk about to get closer to him. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that she was truly amazing. Ariadne in turn froze in surprise, but a moment later she looked at the prince with a smile. He sighed heavily and said that he probably couldn't give up his food. She smiled shyly and said that she couldn't either. She smiled and said that the bread here was not very tasty, so she gave in, and if they fed her better, she would hardly have done this. He asked in surprise if the bread was really tasteless. She sighed heavily and said that there was neither milk nor butter in it. Ariadne looked closely at the prince and said that she could only taste wheat and salt. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he smiled shyly at her, but said nothing. She looked at him with an innocent smile, knowing that she didn't even have to act like she knew he was a prince. They sat quietly in each other's company for a while. He looked at her intently and asked how much longer she would be here. She sighed heavily and looking at the prince said that she would be here until tomorrow. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would continue to give her food to that girl. She thought for a moment and said that she had only wanted to help her until today, but she had been treated to such a delicious apple that she had decided to change her mind and would now go without food tomorrow. He looked at the young lady in surprise for a moment, then gave her a soft smile. A moment later, he slowly reached into his pocket. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was doing. He looked at the lady with a gentle smile and said that it would be nice if she could eat something else, but unfortunately, he had nothing except a few cookies. She looked in surprise at the cookie he handed her. The young lady smiled as she understood that getting closer to the prince was much easier than she imagined. Ariadne smiled and thanked the prince. She said that she would gladly eat what he gave her. A moment later, she stood up and said that it was time for her to go. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was leaving already. She sighed heavily and said that she needed to return before her absence from classes was noticed. The young lady smiled and said goodbye to the prince. She was confused, as she did not know how soon such an opportunity would arise again. But she was very glad that she had the chance to meet the prince, and they were able to talk to each other freely. She knew that she needed to leave behind a slight trace of regret. A moment later, the prince, looking at the young lady, asked her to stop. He smiled and said that he would like to know her name. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise, as she had not expected him to ask such a question. A moment later, she said her name with a radiant smile. The prince in turn looked at the young lady with embarrassment. He was struck by her radiant smile. Sometime later, she returned to her house. Madame looked at her in surprise and asked who was next to her. The young lady looked at Madame intently and said that she had brought the girl from the charity home. Madame asked her angrily if she was completely out of her mind. She was furious and asked Ariadne who she was to make decisions about hiring servants. Madame shouted at her that she apologized in words, but in reality, she continued to do whatever she wanted. A moment later, the young lady bowed to her mother and, handing her the handkerchief, told her to look at it. The madam shouted angrily at the girl that she would not be able to fool her. Isabella pushed her mother away and quickly ran to her sister after seeing the handkerchief and the initials on it. She looked at her sister in surprise and asked if this scarf really belonged to Prince Alfonso. She hastily asked her sister where she got the scarf from. The young lady looked closely at her sister as she immediately guessed everything she said, that she and the prince met there by chance. The charity house is under the patronage of the queen. It must have been a planned visit by the prince. She sighed heavily and said that since she had expressed a desire to take care of this girl, the prince had decided that she would take her into her house and give her work. And since he knew about the good deeds of the cardinal, he had given her his handkerchief as a token of gratitude. The young lady in turn said that if she refused to accept the gift, she would tarnish her father's honor. Of course, this was all a pure lie. The madam looked at her with fury and asked if the prince had told her so she could ignore the mistress of the house. The madam asked with fury if she had really decided to bring a ragamuffin into the house to mock her. The madam screamed furiously at the girl to throw the ragamuffin out the door immediately. She quickly pushed the young lady and shouted at her to clean up with her. Adriana was a little puzzled, as the madame was very stubborn. She knew that if the girl was thrown out now, everything would be difficult, but Madame in turn did not stop screaming. She wanted them both to go away. Isabella in turn looked intently at her mother and shouted that she wanted to go there too. The madam looked at her daughter in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She walked closer to her daughter and quickly slapped her on the back. She shouted that this place was no place for people like her. She shouted that tea parties were for meeting the prince. Isabella looked at her mother and said that she agreed with her to go there. She quickly shouted to her mother that in that case the girl would stay with them. Madame was in shock and did not understand what her daughter was talking about. Isabella looked intently at her mother and cried out excitedly that when they met the prince, they would need to have a conversation about something. She screamed that her father would not allow her to meet the prince, and they needed to think about everything in advance. The young lady in turn was very happy as she understood that everything had become much easier thanks to stupid Isabella. She was happy because she understood that now the young girl would be able to serve in their house, and she also later wanted to make her her personal maid. A moment later, Isabella took the handkerchief from the young lady with a smirk. As she left, she told her sister that she had done a good job. The young lady in turn was furious, but she knew that she should not stop her sister. She sighed heavily as she realized that her life was still the same as before. Something was given to her, and something was taken away. A moment later, the young girl called out to her mistress and thanked her for saving her. Sancha looked at the young lady intently and said that she would definitely repay her for this. The young lady in turn froze in place. She did not expect to hear such a thing at all. But a moment later, she smiled and stroked the young girl's head and thanked her. A few days later, the young lady was strolling leisurely through the estate. Isabella looked at her mother in surprise and asked why the queen had invited them so suddenly. Madame smiled and said that perhaps, having heard about their beautiful Isabella, she wanted to see her. The young lady asked her mother with a smile if the prince would be there. She said that she thought she should take a handkerchief with her. The young lady in turn looked at them with fury as she was disgusted by their conversations. She wondered for a moment if they had been invited to the palace in a past life. She slowly entered the room and saw the maids. The maid looked intently at the young lady and said with disdain that Madame had ordered her to be collected for the exit. Sancha looked at the young lady with an innocent smile and said that a carriage had arrived from the royal palace. She smiled and said that they were informed that she was supposed to be there. The young lady was surprised. She didn't expect to hear such a thing. She sighed heavily as she now realized that she was going to the palace with her stepmother and sister. She looked closely at the outfit that was on the bed. The young lady in turn looked at them with a smirk as a plan had already formed in her head. She slowly walked up to her maid and said that she should play dress-up with her. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise as she did not understand what was being discussed. According to the Holy Scriptures, Isak Gan the saint sacrificed himself twice. For the first time he was branded by the people and died alone. However, the miracle of the resurrection was revealed. The sacrifice was made for the salvation of the people. Having descended from God's punishment to the mainland, only after this did Isak Gan become worthy of human veneration. Although the aristocracy of San Carlo was closer to the Mass than to his final fate, today the words of the first sacrifice were raised at the liturgy. The service was conducted in the native language of Queen Margaret, which comes from the kingdom of Caligo. Isabella and her mother sat quietly and looked at everyone present with bewilderment, as they could not make out a word. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that no one would think that about them. In fact, neither Lucretia, who had given up her studies in the language of Caligo, nor Isabella, who had just begun to study it, understood anything. A moment later, the young lady looked intently at the woman who was sitting not far from her. She looked at her intently, for she knew that it was Queen Margaret. In her past life, she had seen this image only in portraits, which were unable to convey the noble aura surrounding her. After finishing the prayer, Ariadne quietly said the words of the prayer, and Isabella in turn loudly finished the prayer with a smile, and everyone looked at her intently. Everyone looked at the young lady in surprise, but she only smiled her innocent smile. Isabella said with a smile that she was grateful that the queen personally invited them to the service for the sacrifice of Isak Gan, because she really liked that part. The madam smiled as she looked at her daughter and said that it seemed that studying the language was doing her good. She smiled and asked her daughter what she liked most. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she said with a radiant smile that the final part about the second sacrifice was closer to her heart. Ariadne looked at her sister in confusion as she realized that sacrifice was the only word she could make out of what was said. Ariadne knew that today's place was dedicated to his first victim, and she was now talking about another. Isabella smiled and said that after the death of Isak, all the people came out and mourned him. She smiled, and with a radiant smile asked how happy it was for him to hear the sorrow over his own death. Everyone froze in shock. They didn't know how to react to her words. Madame was shocked because the girl was jealous of his fame after his death, instead of being grateful for the sacrifice he made for the people. Her friend was surprised and wondered how old the girl was that she was behaving so immaturely. The young lady, in turn, was very happy because she knew that she would be reminded of all this. She understood perfectly well that now the cardinal's family would have a bad reputation. She smiled and said that she could relate to Isak Gan's courage. She said that he was simply amazing. With tears in her eyes, she said that he must have been very afraid to die. Everyone looked closely at the young lady as they saw that she was very young, but already very good-natured. They said that her faith in God was strong. Ariadne sighed heavily. She knew that this should be enough to put an end to the rumors about the cardinal's family's promiscuity. Madame looked closely at everyone present, and with a smile told them to all go into the small hall, as tea would soon begin. The queen thought for a moment. A few minutes later, she said that the second daughter also understood the language of Caligo well. All those present looked intently at the new guests. Madame informed everyone present that members of Cardinal de Mere's family had arrived. The queen looked at them closely and said that she had seen them at Mass. She was very glad that they had come to tea, and she also said that they could sit down. Madame looked at Miss Isabella and said with a smile that she had a very beautiful dress. Ariadne looked closely at the lady, as she was surprised and did not expect to meet her here. She remembered how, in her past life, she had a shuffle with the countess. The countess looked at the lady with a smile and asked who had sewn the outfit for her. Isabella showed off her outfit with a radiant smile and said that it was the work of their family dressmaker. The countess smiled and said that she seemed to have golden hands, and she even felt a little sorry since she wanted to use the services of such a talented dressmaker. Lucretia smiled and said that she could turn to their worker, since they were always happy to meet the countess in their house. The countess looked at Madame with a grin. She said with a grin that she thought the dressmaker had not yet finished sewing the outfit for her second daughter. For this reason, she did not want to add extra work to her yet. The countess looked at Madame and said that considering how different the second daughter's appearance was, and considering how uneducated the first had shown herself to be, the elder daughter was not up to the mark. The countess told Madame that while in an illegal marriage, she continued to care only for her eldest daughter. However, a virtuous wife must care for all children, and anything else is unacceptable. The countess looked at them intently and said that the girl was not guilty of anything, Isabella looked intently at the Countess, and asking for forgiveness, said that she would like to add something. She smiled, and said that her little sister had recently returned from the village, where she had stayed for health reasons, so she did not have many clothes, and the seamstress had just started sewing. She smiled and said that for today's event, she lent her sister her outfit because they are almost the same age. She smiled and said that sisters are supposed to share everything. She looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that there seemed to be a misunderstanding since her previous clothes had been tailored to her modest taste. Isabella looked at her sister intently and asked if she was right. The young lady in turn glanced sideways at her sister since she knew without words what her thoughts were. She knew that Isabella was waiting for her to give the right answer. A moment later, her expression changed, and with a radiant smile, she said that everything was exactly like that. She smiled and said shyly that this outfit was even too perfect for someone like her. She slowly stood up and showed off her exquisite outfit. All the ladies present froze in shock. She twirled around in front of everyone with a radiant smile and said that she had no idea that this dress was for her sister, but she really liked it. Everyone was surprised and shocked when they saw the dirty hem of the dress. She really wanted to show them something, and for that reason, she needed to stand up to her full height. She looked at her sister with a smirk because she knew that she would clearly appreciate such an answer. A moment later, everyone started whispering as they saw the state of the hem of the outfit. They said that most likely the outfit was pleasantly worn from long work in the kitchen. They said that most likely it was just the outfit of some servant. The Countess looked closely at Madame and said with a grin that it was similar. They were raising the cardinal's daughter like a servant. Madame froze in shock, not knowing what to answer. The lady looked at Isabella and asked if Ariadne was just wearing her clothes. Isabella hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the queen looked sharply at everyone present and told them all to calm down. She looked at Isabella intently and said that she had one more question for her. She looked at her with a cold gaze and asked if she had ever worn such a petticoat before. Isabella in turn hesitated. She could not answer the question asked. The queen looked at Madame intently and said that everything was clear to her. She told her to take her eldest daughter and return home. The queen looked at Madame intently and then addressed her by her maiden name, thereby humiliating her. The young lady in turn looked at Madame with a smirk because she knew that she was now being openly treated as a mistress. She knew that this was a shame for her. The queen looked at her maid and told her to take her second daughter and give her a clean lift. Madame walked slowly past the young lady and said that she would do everything now. Ariadne was a little surprised. She did not expect anything like this at all. For a moment she stood frozen in surprise, not knowing what to do. Some time later, the young lady walked along the corridor of the castle with Madame. She looked around slowly, as she could not imagine that she would find herself in the queen's palace again. She remained in the queen's palace for 9 years as Cesare's bride. She, the young lady in turn, was furious, as she really wanted to erase this from her memory. A moment later, lost in her thoughts, she stumbled and accidentally bumped into Madame. A moment later, the Madame said that the crown prince was coming towards them. The young lady in turn was surprised and shouted out the prince's name. He froze in surprise, as he did not expect to see her in the palace. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was the crown prince. He hesitated, not knowing what to say. Madame was taken aback and looked at the young lady with anger. She shouted that it was not polite for her to behave in such a way. Madame sighed heavily and said that before the young lady now stood the only heir of King Leo III and Her Majesty Margaret, His Highness Prince Alfonso de Carlo. The madam in turn shouted at the young lady to behave accordingly with the prince. Ariadne looked closely at Madame, as she knew that it was not customary for a cardinal's daughter to bow to the palace servants, but she was Her Majesty's trusted servant, so everything that Carla saw and heard would reach the queen. The young lady looked at the prince intently, and bowing said that she had not behaved in the best way. She asked for forgiveness for her impolite behavior. The prince sighed heavily and said to Carla that he had deliberately not told the young lady that he was a prince. He had said that the young lady was simply his friend. The madame was shocked. She looked closely at the prince and asked what he was talking about. She did not understand what kind of friendship he was talking about. She shouted that this was simply unacceptable. The prince looked at her intently and asked if someone who received him without knowing his status could not be his friend. She shouted that people belong to different levels of society, depending on their status for a reason, and accordingly, everyone's intentions and characters are different, and for this reason, he should not forget his place. The prince in turn sulked and turned away from her. She saw that he was not yet a grateful child, and it was enough for her to just look at his displeased expression. The young lady in turn knew that even the most exemplary gentleman, during his period of maturity, cannot resist his desires. She looked at him in surprise as he smiled back at her. A moment later, he grabbed her hand with a smile and shouted that they should run. Madame was in shock. She shouted at the prince to stop. She did not understand where they were going. The young lady in turn was very surprised, but still followed the prince. Some time later, they stopped in the park. The prince in turn looked around intently. He was taken aback when he realized that he was holding the young lady's hand. He quickly let go of her. Ariadne looked at him with a smile and said that he was reacting too openly. He timidly said that she could call him by his name. Ariadne looked at him intently and with a playful smile asked if she was allowed to show him such respect. He looked away from her and asked her to stop saying such things. The prince sheepishly said that she didn't have to address him that way. The young lady in turn looked intently at the prince and gave him her beautiful smile. She said that, in that case, they could choose fictitious names for themselves. The prince froze in shock, as he did not expect to see such a beautiful smile. He jokingly asked if she really wanted to call him by some affectionate nickname. From that day on, she had an embarrassed look on her face. He asked if she was too confident in herself. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that if she continued to call his name every time they met, then others would understand that he was a prince. He looked at her in surprise. He sighed heavily and said that she was right. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the offer to start a secret relationship was a temptation that was difficult to refuse. He smiled and said that, in that case, they would do so. Ariadne smiled and asked if it was true. For a while they went through different nicknames, but the prince in turn was a little over the top. She looked at the prince intently, as she was shocked that he didn't even object. A moment later, she took his hand with a smile and traced a name on his palm. The prince was very surprised and at the same time embarrassed. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that there was something he had not told her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The prince sighed heavily and said that the queen had called her to them today because of him. He said sadly that she had been informed that they had met at the charity house. The prince, puzzled, said that whoever he met and whomever he saw, they told his mother about everything. He looked closely at the young lady and said that the most surprising thing was that it was the story about her that attracted his mother's attention. She looked closely at the prince, as she had previously thought that he was not so attentive to his surroundings. She was amazed at how well the prince was aware of what was happening around him. She looked closely at the prince, as everything was becoming very interesting. The prince sighed heavily and said with sadness in his voice that of course he understood that his mother was doing this out of concern for him. However, sometimes this concern choked him from within. He sighed heavily, but did not say it. A moment later, his face changed, and he looked intently at the young lady. He smiled a timid smile and said that he was talking too much about himself. He suggested that she talk about something else. The lady slowly moved towards him and gently stroked his head. He froze in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing from her at all. Ariadne looked intently at the prince, or breathing heavily, said that it must be very difficult. Ariadne smiled and said that they were probably already looking for her, and if she did not return now, she would be reprimanded. She smiled and said that the queen said that she would give her other clothes. A moment later, she said that she had to leave already. The prince in turn did not answer the young lady. He was embarrassed by her behavior. Madame screamed in her residence with indignation. She was furious because they addressed her as the cardinal's mistress, right in public. She furiously beat everything that came into her hands. She was puzzled and did not understand how they dared to insult her, so she shouted that they were just filthy scum and from the kingdom of Caligo. Ariadne, in turn, looked intently at Madame and at how she was destroying her room. A moment later, she slowly walked up to her and said that she had returned, calling her mother Madame, looked at her with fury, and asked if she really thought that she was her mother and that she was allowed to call her that. She screamed furiously at Ariadne and told her to immediately admit that she had deliberately soiled her dress. The lady, in turn, looked at Madame with fury, as was expected from her. She bowed and said that she could not do such a thing, and that she had no other clothes, except this one. Madame angrily asked her who was responsible for this outfit. Madame screamed at the servants to search her room and find the real petticoat. Ariadne, in turn, mocked Madame, as she was furious, but she knew that even if her room was turned upside down, she would not find anything. She looked at Madame intently, knowing she had to think quickly of a way to silence her this time. A moment later, the maid screamed and called for Madame. Ariadne turned around with fury and looked at Maleta. The maid looked intently at Madame and shouted that she knew who was to blame for the situation. Everyone looked intently at her. The young lady in turn looked warily at the maid, as she had completely forgotten that she needed to take care of Maleta's silence. Maleta screamed furiously and blamed her sister for this situation. Sancha, in shock, she looked at the young lady in fear. The madam furiously attacked the maid and, grabbing her by the hair, asked if it was really she who decided to steal the petticoat. The maid was shocked and screamed that she had not done it. Maleta, a few minutes later, ran to Madam with a smile on her face and holding a petticoat in her hands. She shouted that it was in her things. The young lady of the university was in her turn furious, as she had managed to avoid suspicion that it was she who had brought shame on Lucretia in front of everyone. The madam angrily struck the maid in the face, and she fell to the ground with a crash. Ariadne, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. She remembered how the maid told her that she would definitely repay her for her kindness. She remembered the golden rule: since sinful deeds will be punished, and good deeds will be returned in kind, you need to treat your neighbor the way you want him to treat you. She was angry and regretted the betrayal she had suffered, but she neglected others for her own benefit. The young lady was shocked because she realized that only she could hear these words. The madam looked at the maid with fury and shouted that she was just an ungrateful bitch. A pen fell into her hand and she waved it. She furiously wanted to hit the maid with the tip of her pen. Ariadne shouted at Madame not to do it. The maid froze in horror. Madame struck the blow with fury. The maid opened her eyes in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was happening. She did not feel any pain from the blow, but she knew that Madame had struck it. Ariadne in turn screamed in pain. The maid was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing from her mistress. A moment later, the maid was taken aback. She screamed at her mistress, asking why she had done such a thing. She was in shock because her mistress had a large wound on her shoulder. Ariadne looked closely at her maid and told her to tell them the truth, that it was she who ordered her to do this. Sancha looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes, and taking her hand, shook her head. She didn't want to do this at all. The young lady was in shock. She didn't expect this from the maid. The madam looked at the girl with fury and asked if she had really decided to make fun of her now. A moment later, the cardinal entered the room. He was surprised and did not understand what was happening. He did not understand why there was so much noise in the room. He looked at everyone present with anger and asked how they dared to do such a thing in his house. Madame looked at him with fury and asked why he had only come now. She was asking him if he knew what had happened to her today. The young lady in turn took the maid by the arm and quickly left them. She returned to the room with lightning speed, while the cardinal and madame were quarreling. The young lady looked closely at her maid and called her Sancha. Trembling with fear, looked at her mistress and said that she had a wound on her shoulder. She said that the ointment needed to be applied quickly. Ariadne looked closely at the maid and said that she should have told the truth, since it was her fault. Ariadne was surprised and did not understand why her maid acted in such a way. Sancha looked intently at her mistress and with a gentle smile said that it was all because she saved her life. She looked at the young lady and said with a soft smile that she was her benefactor and she would definitely repay her for everything, and she would always be on her side. Ariadne was very surprised by her words, because she knew that her family did not need her. She was abandoned by her lover, and no one had ever been on her side. The lady burst into tears, for she knew that she had let the servant into this house only for her own selfish purposes, and her intentions were not at all good. But despite this, the young maid supported her. The young lady rushed to hug the maid. She asked her for forgiveness. Sancha froze in shock and surprise. On the spot, she did not expect such a thing from her mistress. Ariadne spoke with tears in her eyes about her servant, saying that, from that moment on, she would always protect her. Ariadne said about her maid that she would certainly make sure that her sister left her alone. She screamed that make sure that no one would threaten them anymore. Ariadne said that she would certainly protect her. The maid was amazed by her mistress's words. She hugged her with a gentle smile. A few days later, the estate was quiet. The young lady, in turn, sat quietly in bed and stared at her hands. She was puzzled and didn't know what she saw then. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that if she continued to touch the insect-bitten area, it would only get worse. Ariadne looked closely at the maid and told her to look at her hands. She asked if it seemed to her that her finger had become larger. The maid looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she really meant to say that it had swollen so much in just a day. Ariadne sighed heavily and looked closely at her hands. She said that it seemed so. The young lady looked closely at her maid and said that she was not at all what she seemed to her at the first meeting. Sancha sat down on the bed, looked at the lady, and asked what her first impression of her was. The young lady said with a smile that she was like a little kitten that she picked up on the street. She smiled and said that now she is completely different and very sharp-tongued. The maid looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and told her to stop talking nonsense and go to class quickly. She asked the lady if she really wanted to come later than the language teacher. Caligo Adriana looked closely at the maid with an innocent smile on her face. A moment later, she rose from her bed and said that she really had to go. Approaching the door, she stopped and looked at her maid with a gentle smile. Adriana said that she would be back soon. The maid smiled and waved back. Adriana, in turn, walked leisurely to class. She was in a very good mood since time flew by, unnoticed during the conversation with her maid. She walked slowly down the corridor and planned what she would do after school with the maid. A moment later, the young lady stopped at the door, having heard someone talking. Madame looked at the cardinal and asked if she had to live there. The cardinal looked at her in surprise and said that it was her idea to bring Ariadne here in the first place. Madame was puzzled. She said that something had happened a long time ago, but now everything was different. She said that the girl was very stubborn and difficult to keep track of. He looked at her intently and said that if it was so painful for them to live together, they could quickly marry her off to Count Cesare. The lady in turn froze in shock at the door. She did not expect to hear anything like that at all. The only reason the cardinal did not want to give Isabella to Cesare was her high value. She was so valuable that it was simply a shame to marry her off to him. The cardinal considered his daughter the most useful weapon in order to sell her more profitably. He trained, raised, pampered, and cherished Isabella. All this was necessary in order to exchange her for wealth and the honor of society. And he considered the only heir to the throne, Prince Alfonso, to be the most suitable partner for the exchange. The young lady was furious. She understood that if it was all about Isabella's value, the cardinal intended to make her queen. She understood perfectly well that she had to become more valuable to him than she was. Ariadne understood that if this was not enough, then she would have to devalue Isabella. She walked slowly into the room, putting a smiling mask on her face. She noticed that her sisters were already learning the language. The young lady walked slowly into the room and greeted Madame in a foreign language. She bowed politely and with a smile and apologized for disturbing him. Her sisters were shocked because they did not expect her to be able to speak this language. The madam quickly ran up to the young lady and said in surprise that her pronunciation was simply superb. She was surprised and did not know where the girl had studied. Ariadne smiled and said that among the people she grew up with, there was one person who knew Caligo well. The young lady said with a gentle smile that, however, before she did not know either grammar or the correct expression, but after meeting Madame, she mastered everything that she lacked. She looked closely at Madame and said with a smile that it was all thanks to her. Madame froze in place in surprise and embarrassment. Madame smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that she spoke another language perfectly and that she had excellent etiquette. The madam looked at her closely and said that it was nothing more than a natural talent. The young lady looked away from the madam with an embarrassed smile. She was a little puzzled, as she knew that it was just her many years of experience. Arabella looked at her sister with fury and indignantly asked how she knew so well how to speak a foreign language. Arabella screamed at her sister that this was one of the tricks she wanted to pull. She screamed at her that she was just a liar. Ariadne looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that it was not at all proper for her to shout like that in front of the teacher. Madame looked closely at the lady and asked if she had made her debut in high society yet. Madame looked at the lady with a gentle smile and said that she was already completely ready to go out into high society. Isabella, in turn, looked at Madame with fury. Isabella was furious because her sister was getting the attention she should have been getting. She was furious and didn't understand how her sister dared to do this. For a moment, she thought about the smirk on her face, as she knew that all the eyes of the aristocrats would be focused only on her. A tightly cinched corset, the tip of a crystal, barely touched her chest. Makeup made with pearl powder, a blush on her lips and cheeks, created from rose water, she was dazzling attractive. In the kingdom, the state administration was based on religion. The monarchs and nobles were souls who had acquired many virtues in their past lives and received favors in the present. Common people are those who have sinned in their previous lives, therefore noble souls must guide and govern the sinners. That is why in a kingdom, the religion that gives power to the rulers must be absolute. That is why one very important event is held here. Once a month, the royal estate's nobles and commoners gather together to listen to the great mass where the cardinal conveys the words of the Holy Spirit. The cardinal and his family slowly entered the temple. Everyone looked intently and with admiration at the young Isabella. The young lady next to her in turn shone with beauty. They looked at her closely because they noticed that she was wearing a blue dress today. They noticed her golden cross on her neck. They said that it looked like it was the work of the jeweler Luke. They were amazed by her beauty. The men sighed heavily after the young lady, as it was difficult for them to express their admiration in words. The young lady in turn was very glad that all eyes were on her. Straightening her beautiful back, she slowly walked past everyone present. But a moment later, she froze in surprise as all attention turned to her sister. Isabella looked at her sister with surprise and indignation. But a moment later, she looked at her with a smirk, for she saw that her sister was not wearing any makeup. Her hair was tied tightly. She was wearing a black, dull, and somber dress, and she was also wearing a simple silver cross. The young lady, in turn, quickly turned around, as she knew that her sister was poor, and she did not need to pay attention to her. Ariadne looked closely at her sister, because she knew that she was just stupid. She knew that no matter how much her sister showed off bragging about expensive things, no one would remember her. Ariadne knew that if events in this life were to repeat events in the past, then something was bound to happen in the temple today. She knew that a very interesting situation would happen in the temple today, namely a blasphemy that would shake the established kingdom events that would become decisive and lead to her engagement to Cesare. It was King Leo III of Estrus, who then rescued the cardinal, who had fallen into trouble because of this incident, after which His Majesty made offers to the cardinal as payment for his help. He looked at the cardinal intently and told him to become a force for his illegitimate son, who had no power. This is how the illegitimate son of the ruler of the kingdom got involved with such a useless woman as she. She knew that if she couldn't change the past from this moment on, then she would have to marry Cesare again, and everything would repeat itself for her. The young lady in turn prayed furiously and asked God to make the events of the past happen again. For some time the young man looked intently at the young lady. He looked at Isabella with a smirk as he saw that she was the perfect thing for him. Cesare de Como, the most handsome man in San Carlo, the rarest jewels, outstanding breeds, racehorses, beautiful women. All this was in the hands of the young aristocrat. First of all, he was the king's favorite son, and his adored mistress, Countess Rubina, and it was natural that everyone envied him. He looked intently at the young lady, for he knew that only the most beautiful girl of San Carlo was worthy of becoming his wife. He looked intently at the young lady, not taking his keen eyes off her, for he knew that he would soon have to ask the cardinal for her hand again. She should try her luck at the meeting next month by giving feedback on the upcoming wedding. A moment later, he noticed his father and his son having a good time. He looked at his brother with fury. He saw that his father was laughing. He looked at them with fury because he knew that he should be standing in his brother's place. Being illegitimate, he could only be recognized as the king's heir in his mother's secret chamber. A moment later, he looked at the young lady in surprise as he had not seen her before. He quickly turned around and, looking at his mother, asked her who the girl in the black nondescript dress was from the cardinal's family. Madame said that the girl was the cardinal's second daughter, his other mistress, and she had heard that the girl had already managed to attract the queen's attention. He looked at his mother in surprise and asked what was so special about her. The madam sighed heavily and told her son not to judge a person by his appearance, since considering that she was able to please such a fastidious person as the queen, she was not so simple. He sighed heavily, as he did not know where a woman could use her mind. The madam looked closely at her son and asked if he thought his mother had only reached the throne thanks to her beautiful face. He looked at her in surprise and asked if that was really not the case. Madame sighed heavily and said that he was simply poor and stupid. Cesare looked sideways at everyone present and said that it turned out that the sermon had already begun. A moment later, he looked at the man, thought for a moment, and said that it looked like this was the Apostle Asaretto. Apostle Asaretto, a man who gained great fame among the poor and needy. Contrary to the teachings of faith, where the birth of a person is simply interpreted by us as his excessive and sinful past life, with his lips, he carried the previously unheard of heresy that even the most humble sinners can become sons of God if they only assimilate the teachings of the Holy Spirit and follow them in their present life. After his words, every low water could receive a high status. The apostle looked at everyone present and said that at birth he was a simple man, having come to the diet of the world in Ambra as the son of a shepherd. Yisak lived like an ordinary person until at the age of 30, the Holy Spirit overshadowed him, testifying that he was the Son of God. The cardinal froze in shock on the spot. The apostle said that only when he was chosen by God through the first sacrifice, he born a simple man, was called a saint, and endowed with the same divinity as God. The cardinal was shocked because he realized that the man was a real heretic. He knew that his philosophy was contrary to the foundations of their country. The cardinal was furious and did not understand how he dared to preach a sermon that trampled on their faith at a mass that he himself was leading. He understood perfectly well that if he did nothing about this, he, along with the apostle, would be called a heretic. The cardinal was puzzled, as he had been invited to the Mass personally by His Holiness, and his attempt to stop the sermon would be regarded as an insult to the ruler. He was very puzzled because he did not know what to do. The man shouted that Yeshak Gon was the Son of Man, thereby classifying Yeshak as a mere mortal, contrary to the scriptures. The young lady in turn stood up and shouted at him to be ashamed. She looked at the man intently, with fury in her eyes. He froze in surprise. The cardinal turned around in surprise and looked intently at his daughter. She looked at the man intently and asked him angrily who he was to contradict the Holy Scriptures. Ariadne looked at him intently and quoted the line in the copies. He looked at her intently and shouted that the eternally existing God created his son from nothingness. It is logical that he is his creation. She looked at him with anger and asked who he was, since he claimed to know the truth better than Saint Manuel and Saint Sandro, who served him. He looked at her intently and said that he was nothing more than an inhabitant of the island village, a seeker of the word of God, and thus he was seeking the truth. He looked at her intently and asked if they did not worship the one and only Almighty God. A moment later, the young lady angrily quoted one of the chapters of the poem. She said that he appeared in the flesh of the Father of the Holy Spirit, and he revealed that the Holy Spirit is his Son. The cardinal looked at them with anger. He did not know what to do. She looked at him intently and asked if he really considered himself to know more than Paulo. He was one of the 6 apostles. She looked intently at the man and called out to him. She grabbed him by the clothes and said that he seemed to be trying to ignore the Holy Scriptures. For some time the dispute between them did not subside, and one of the parties did not think of giving up. The man quickly ran up to the ruler and nervously said that, unfortunately, the situation on the lower floor was simply terrible. He asked if he should take the man out of the building. The king sighed heavily and asked his assistant which of the two he meant. The man looked nervously at the king and said that, of course, he meant the girl. The king in turn looked at his assistant with a grin. A moment later, he looked closely at his assistant and said that the apostle could have been sent away earlier. He looked at the man in surprise and asked why they were sending away that amazing girl. He told the assistant to find out what kind of family she was from, since her value was worthy of admiration. A moment later, the prince sighed heavily and called the young lady's name, and the king looked at his son in surprise. The prince looked at his father with a beaming smile and said that she was his friend. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said with a gentle smile that she was his most beloved friend. Ariadne looked at the man with fury and asked if he really wanted to ignore the Holy Scriptures. The cardinal looked at his daughter with fury, for he knew what it was like, how she did not belong there. He was furious because he knew that she was just a rootless brat. He understood perfectly well that before it was too late, he had to fix everything. A moment later, a man burst into the temple and angrily asked everyone present where the accused sinner Alejandra was in the temple. He shouted angrily that he had come here to punish the heretic by order of the head of the church, Louis. Everyone looked intently at the man, whispering quietly among themselves. The cardinal froze in shock as he realized that the inquisitor himself stood before him. The cardinal was shocked. He did not understand how the inquisitor had found out so quickly about everything that was happening here. He understood perfectly well that he should explain this situation before it became more complicated. The man looked at everyone present with rage and shouted for them to immediately bring the accused forward. He looked at the man with anger and said that he denied the unity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He was accused of heresy, distorting the nature of the Holy Scripture. He looked at the man with fury and said that for this reason, they label him a heretic and excommunicate him from the church immediately. The man stood there in shock and surprise, but he was also very angry. The cardinal rushed at full speed to the inquisitor. The inquisitor looked at the cardinal with fury and called him. The cardinal asked the inquisitor to listen to him. The inquisitor angrily told the cardinal that he would also be held responsible for preaching a heretic in a high-octane temple. The cardinal froze in place at the sound as he realized that he would also be punished. He was shocked as he realized that perhaps his guilt had been slightly embellished in order to limit him in the affairs of the church. The cardinal sighed as he understood perfectly well that no matter what, since the inquisitor had personally come to them as a representative of its head, everything he said now would be indisputable. He knew that he needed to try to calmly explain everything that was happening without provoking him. The cardinal looked at the inquisitor intently and asked him to listen to him, as he knew that there had been some misunderstanding and he had not invited the heretic to preach at all. A moment later, a young lady intervened in their conversation. Ariadne looked intently at the inquisitor and asked him to listen to her. The apostle's sermon on the appearance of the inquisitor for his punishment, all this happened to her in that life. She looked intently at everyone present, and she understood that it was from this moment that the gambling game began. The inquisitor looked at the young lady with fury and asked how dare a girl go from a lowly position to such a Minos-like matter. She looked intently at the inquisitor and without flinching said that she was the cardinal's second daughter. She looked at him intently and said that his lordship did not intend to cooperate with the accused. Ariadne looked at him intently and said that he was afraid of the heresy he was presenting, so he prepared a refutation. The cardinal froze in place in shock and surprise. He did not understand what she was talking about. He quickly rushed to his daughter and, tugging her by the shoulders, told her that she had better shut up, and immediately. He looked at her with fury and asked if she understood what she had just said. With her words, the young lady confirmed that the cardinal knew about everything in advance. He shouted at her that she should not speak so freely at all. The man looked at the cardinal in surprise and asked what kind of refutation he was talking about. He asked the young lady if she had really decided to intercede. He sighed heavily and asked if she had really decided to joke with him. He looked at them with fury and said that not only had the cardinal allowed a heretic to preach, but he had also brought his daughter, which had turned the Mass into children's games. The cardinal was shocked and shouted that everything was wrong. The inquisitor looked at them with fury and asked if they were mocking the great Mass. The young lady looked at him intently, as she realized that he considered this rude, but if she gave in to him now, her plan would fail, and that would be the end of her. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she was acting this way only out of respect for the head of the church, since he had personally invited the apostles to them. They did not know how the Inquisition would react if the cardinal began to object before the start of his guest's sermon. The inquisitor, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. He did not know what to say. The young lady looked at him intently, as she knew that everything was going just fine, and according to her plan, she said that the cardinal was deeply concerned about the apostles' ideas and therefore prepared in advance. She looked at the inquisitor intently and said that the cardinal had collected all the evidence from today's sermon for a public refutation. She looked at her father intently and with a playful smile asked if she was wrong. The man froze in shock and stared at his daughter. Ariadne looked at him with a grin. A moment later, the cardinal shouted that everything was correct and she was completely right. The cardinal looked at the inquisitor intently and said that it was simply astonishing why on earth would His Holiness invite an apostle to preach on such a day. She smiled and said that she would return the matter to the fact that the head of the church was also overshadowed, since heresy always hides under the guise of holiness. The inquisitor froze in shock, unable to tell if it was true or not. He looked at them intently and asked if they were really telling him the truth now. The inquisitor looked closely at everyone present as they whispered among themselves and were told that her young lady had literally saved the good name and their kingdoms. If not for her action, they would have continued listening to this heretic until the inquisitor arrived. They looked at her closely and said that she was a very brave young lady and that she held the Holy Scriptures in very high esteem, as befits a cardinal's daughter. They smiled and did not say that she was a true disciple of her father. They said that she was simply a hero. The inquisitor looked at the young lady in surprise, but sighed heavily and said that he heard them. A moment later, he shouted that in that case, his business here was finished for today. Ariadne looked at him intently as she realized that she had succeeded. She sighed heavily because she knew that she had been able to prove her worth to her father in front of all the inhabitants of the kingdom. She knew that the most important thing was that she had managed to eliminate the reason for the engagement. She was very happy because she understood that now she did not have to marry the count. The king laughed throughout the hall. He noticed that the young lady was not as simple as she seemed. He was very excited because it seemed to him that he watched like an act in a play. After this situation, he smiled and said that he would even believe that all this was prepared in advance with the head of the church. The man sighed heavily and said that they say that reality is more dramatic than fictional stories. The king smiled and said that a girl with such strong faith deserves a reward. He thought for a moment, as he did not know what reward to offer the young lady. The man smiled and told the king that various jewelry or outfits might suit the young lady. The king thought for a moment and said that the blue heart of the ocean depths would be perfect. The man froze in shock and looked at the king and asked what he was talking about. Blue heart of the ocean depths is a large, rare, deep blue sapphire. Legend has it that a pod of dolphins swam to the shore and left it there, after which they immediately disappeared. Deep beauty combined with mysterious legends give uniqueness to this stone coveted by all lovers of luxury. Sapphire became the most coveted jewel for the countess, who was the king's mistress. The man was puzzled as he understood that he, the countess, would have to give up the precious stone to some girl. The man sighed heavily and, looking at the king, said that this gift would be too valuable for the young lady. The king sighed heavily and said with a grin that he knew that Rubina also desperately wanted this stone. He looked closely at his assistant and asked with a grin what he thought. If they gave the sapphire to the second daughter, or the cardinal, would she return it after she got married? The man froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear anything like this from the king. He understood perfectly well what he was talking about. The king said with a grin that it would be a great success if he could marry Cesare to her. The cardinal sighed heavily and called his daughter. He was a little excited and also very angry. The cardinal sighed heavily, and his anger ran through him, and asked the young lady where she got such an idea. She sighed heavily and told her father that she was just reading books at his house to keep from getting bored. He turned around and looked at her with fury and asked if she had really thought of all this herself. He was very surprised because he knew that these were not the kind of books that a 15-year-old child could comprehend on his own. The young lady looked at him intently, with a smirk on her face, as she of course assumed that he simply would not believe her. She sighed heavily and, bowing, said that the notes about the essence of the saint made a great impression on her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really read all of it. She smiled and said that the most interesting thing was that Wycliffe focused on studying the structure of assumptions and proved that the Father and the Son are one. Therefore, the Son was repeated many times through the Father. The young lady knew that it was not so popular now, but in a few years, these books would be required reading for every aristocrat. The cardinal looked closely, but the young lady, he was amazed by what she said. A moment later, he turned around and, sighing heavily, said that in the big temple, the priests studied theology. He asked if she wanted to go there. The young lady looked at her father in surprise. She knew that she should not reveal her true intentions. She was taken aback and with a smile told her father that she would be ashamed due to her lack of knowledge. She smiled and said that if he allowed it, she would rather continue studying the books at home, and if she did not understand anything, she would definitely come and ask him. He sighed heavily and, without looking at her, said that he agreed with her and now she could go. The young lady was surprised, as it turned out to be easier than she thought. As she was leaving, she froze in place as her father called her. She was puzzled and wondered if he still had any doubts. She turned around and bowed, saying that she was listening to him. He turned around and looked at the young lady intently, and a moment later said that she was doing well. Adriana froze in shock for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. Madame looked intently at her son, who was drinking wine greedily. She asked if he had heard the stories about the cardinal's second daughter. The madam said that the young lady in turn was very religious, and she was called the Savior. She sighed heavily and said that it was very expected that he had such a child, and the whole kingdom praised the young lady. The young man in turn slowly poured himself a new glass of wine and began drinking. Madame looked at him with fury. She looked at her son with fury and shouted that his wife must also be the embodiment of virtue, and he himself would soon become king. The young man sighed heavily and angrily told his mother to come to her senses. He said with a smirk that his brother had already taken the place of the heir. He did not understand how he could take the throne. The madam looked at her son with fury and shouted that he was contradicting her again. She shouted that she was simply tired of repeating that his father loved him very much. Cesare looked at his mother with fury. A moment later, he rose from his chair, throwing it to the ground in the process. He looked at his mother with fury and shouted that his father loved him so much that he gave him a meager title of nobility and a palace without an inheritance. He shouted that the king had given him only a miserable earldom. Madame in turn looked at her son with fury and anger. A moment later, she picked up the glass with lightning speed and threw it angrily at her son. The glass shattered against the wall with a crash, and the pieces scattered across the room. She looked at him with fury and asked if he dared to raise his voice at her after he was born in her womb. He did not answer, but only turned away from his mother. She grabbed him by the clothes in a fury and pulled him towards her, saying that he would become the next king. As she left, Madame said that she had heard that His Majesty had given that girl the blue heart of the ocean depths. She sighed heavily and asked her son if he knew how much she wanted to get him. He sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. Cesare knew this very well, since she really wanted him because of what the astrologer had once told her. She looked closely at her son and said with a smile that everything was correct. She knew perfectly well that the man who owned it would become king. She looked closely at her son and said that in this case she would become the king's woman, and he would become a true son. She said that the predictions would definitely come true. She walked slowly up to her son and said with a grin that all this was for him. She said that he simply had to get the blue heart from the depths of the ocean. By order of the king, young lady asked Pizza to come to the palace, Her Highness the Queen. The cardinal looked at the young lady intently and said that she should not make trouble and should be modest and should also behave very quietly. The young lady smiled and said that she understood everything and would do everything. She was a little surprised, as she had not at all thought that he would personally accompany her. She knew that this time the invitation came from the queen, as she had to thank her for the king's place. Ariadne, in turn, was only trying to avoid an engagement with Cesare, but things went too far. A moment later, she stopped and stared at her reflection. She sighed heavily as she realized that she looked very simple. She thought for a moment that if she added a flower to her outfit, she would look more elegant. A moment later, she hurried into the garden to pick a flower. She looked around carefully, looking for a flower, because it seemed to her that she was in the backyard of the royal palace, and there were peonies somewhere. A moment later, she turned around in shock as she heard someone calling her. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and shouted that he was sitting on a tree. Adriana, in turn, looked up in surprise. She was very surprised as she did not expect to see the prince in such a place. He looked at her with a smile and called her again. He smiled and said that she should come up to him. A moment later, the young lady was sitting next to the prince. The prince was taken aback when he looked at the young lady as he noticed that she was wearing a very light dress. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile, which of them, without even thinking, ordered to climb the tree. The prince looked at her with a smile. A moment later, he smiled and asked her in all seriousness if she wanted to sit up a little. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. She was shocked because he asked her to sit on his lap. She thought he was very straightforward. She was puzzled and knew that she needed to come to her senses, and now she had no time to think. She knew that, thanks to the prince, she would be able to escape from his brother and from her family. She understood perfectly well that this was her golden chance. The young lady, in turn, did what he asked her to do without haste. She froze in embarrassment, her heart pounding in her chest. A moment later, he smiled and said that everything was ready. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about, the principles of the nose, and said that now her dress would not get dirty. The young lady was puzzled, as she realized that she had only worried her heart in vain, as he carefully laid a handkerchief on the tree for her. He smiled and asked what brought her to the palace. Adriana said that the queen invited her to an audience. The prince smiled and said that he understood what was going on. He said that the king had praised the savior for a long time and was very upset that he could not award her a knighthood. The young lady smiled sheepishly and said that it was a pity, as she could have become an outstanding knight. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted that. She thought for a moment, not knowing what to answer. The prince looked intently at the young lady and with a radiant smile said that he promised her that one day he would bestow upon her a title. Adriana smiled and, looking at the prince, asked if she would have to swear allegiance to him. A moment later, she cleared her throat and, looking at the prince, said that she swears with all her soul that from that moment on, she will be faithful only to her master. She smiled and said that she would protect him in the face of any adversity and put his safety above all else, even her own life. She vowed to always tell the master only the truth and to fulfill all the promises she made to him. She looked closely at the prince, and with a gentle smile said that she would never change her mind and would never leave him, and that she would always be by his side. The prince froze in place in surprise. A moment later, he looked away from her, embarrassed, and asked if it was true. She smiled and asked if he didn't believe her. The prince, embarrassed, looked at his friend and said that if such an intelligent person as she would help him in state affairs, he could become an outstanding ruler. Ariadne froze in shock. She was amazed by what she heard. Adriana was a little puzzled by the sight. It was she who in her past life had trapped the prince, thereby destroying him, and now she was so careless and without a drop of shame in her eyes, swearing allegiance. Adriana understood perfectly well that if he found out what a grave sin she was carrying on her shoulders, he would immediately stop communicating with her and smiling so brightly. A moment later, the young lady accidentally slipped from the tree. The prince was taken aback and shouted at her to grab onto him immediately. With the speed of lightning, the prince caught the young lady in his arms. He looked at her worriedly and asked if she was okay. Adriana, in turn, froze for a moment, but a few minutes later, she thanked him with a smile for saving her. He sighed heavily and said that she should be careful. The young lady, in turn, agreed with the prince. She was a little puzzled as her heart suddenly started pounding hard. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was looking for in that direction, since he knew very well that it was impossible to get an audience with his mother by such a road. She smiled and said that she had wandered into the garden in search of a flower to decorate her hair, as she thought her outfit was too simple. He looked closely at the raisin lady and asked if she was saying that her outfit was simple. He reached closer to her and asked if she was not beautiful. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise. She was taken aback and timidly said that she had no jewelry and her outfit was not elegant enough, and probably not one of the young maidens had ever appeared at the queen's palace in such a wretched state. She froze for a moment as she realized that she had said too much. He looked at her intently because he realized what was bothering her. He looked closely at the young lady and with a gentle smile asked if she would like some of the jewelry. She froze for a moment as he took off his ribbon and tied it around her hair. She was amazed that he took a ribbon from his outfit and tied it to her personally. She smiled and looked at him as she noticed that his soul was very pure and naive. He smiled and asked if it didn't look very strange, as it was the first time he did something like this. The young lady thanked the prince with a radiant smile for such a generous gift. She was truly grateful to him. Some time later, the young lady came to an audience with the queen. The queen slowly read a letter from the king. The queen looked intently at the young lady and told her to get up. The queen slowly approached the gift and, sighing heavily, said that she did not know that the king would choose this as a reward. The young lady, in turn, looked at the queen with bewilderment since she did not understand what was being discussed. She looked intently at the queen and asked the locals if she would like to find out what was going on with her. The queen looked closely at the young lady and said that her reward was 50 gold ducats, a small box of trinkets from her personally, and also the blue heart of the ocean depths. The young lady froze in shock. She had not expected such a thing at all, but moments later she fell to her knees and shouted to the queen that someone like her would not dare to accept such a majestic gift. She begged the queen to understand her. A moment later, the young ladies began to whisper among themselves, for they could not help believing that she was capable of refusing such a treasure. They asked if she did not realize the honor she had been shown. They said that the stone could become her family heirloom. Ariadne knew that for some, it was a matter of family honor and great respect, but for her, it was comparable to a threat to life. She understood perfectly well that anyone who wanted to get the stone for themselves would become a threat to her. The queen looked closely at the young lady and said that she understood the reasons for her action, but meanwhile, it was His Majesty's order. She looked closely at the young lady and told her to accept their gift with respect. The queen leaned over slowly and whispered quietly to the young lady that she alone could not defend herself against them. She told the lady to subdue all those who desperately wanted to get the stone. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she would have to find a balance whereby they would restrain each other. The queen slowly rose to her feet and, looking at the young lady, said that it was not easy, but there was nothing else to do. The young lady looked intently at the queen and called her. For a moment, she looked at the queen in silence, but a moment later, collecting her thoughts, she asked if she could ask for another gift, if it did not seem too impudent a question to them. The queen looked at the young lady intently and said that she could speak. After a while, the young lady told the queen what she wanted. The queen was shocked and looking at the young lady asked what nonsense she was talking. The young lady in turn froze in shock as she did not expect such a reaction from the queen. The queen looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this would no longer be one request, but two. The young lady in turn looked at the queen in surprise. She wondered if she had really succeeded. She was very happy. The queen looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that she would not undertake it, but to say that it would be easy to accomplish. She looked at her intently and said that she already had one suitable gift prepared for her. Adriana looked at the queen in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Madame looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that Her Majesty the Queen seemed to be very kind to her. The queen smiled and said that Miss was younger than them half a century, and besides, she was very sweet, and she thought that was what endeared her to everyone. The maid smiled and said that the young lady reminded her of the queen in her youth, as she was just as smart and modest. The queen laughed and said that she thought they were right in some ways, and that she and the young lady were somewhat alike. The queen sighed heavily and said that her destiny must be different from what had befallen her. The madam looked closely at the young lady and asked if the queen had given her these jewels. Isabella smiled and said that they were very beautiful. She looked closely at the amethyst earrings as she liked them very much. She tried them on with a smile, and looking at her mother, asked if she thought the color of these stones was very similar to the shade of her eyes. Madame smiled, and looking at her daughter, said that she was right, and it was as if they were made especially for her. Isabella looked at her sister intently, and with tears in her eyes asked her to give her the earrings, as they suited her very well. She said that if they did not adorn her, they would become very sad. The young lady in turn froze in shock, as she did not understand what her sister was saying at all. The madam looked at the young lady with a smile and said that her daughter was right. She asked if family members should not share all the benefits among themselves for the sake of common happiness. She told Ariadne that she had also received a significant amount and should give the money to her. The madam smiled and said that she would take care of the money until the hour of her need came. The young lady looked at them intently and said that her wish echoed theirs, but unfortunately, she could not give it all to them at once. Isabella looked at her sister with fury and asked what she was talking about. She told her sister with fury that if you don't want to share with your family, then you should say so about it. Ariadne was taken aback and said that this was not the case at all, since these were all gifts from the queen, and all the jewelry had her initials engraved on it. She looked at them intently and said that whoever goes against the decision, Her Majesty will receive punishment for disgracing the royal family. They looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady slowly moved away from them and said that she had something she wanted to tell them. The lady looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She showed her a document in which she said that the monetary reward was transferred to a charitable house by the decision of the queen. The young lady smiled and told her that she had already donated all the money in the name of her second daughter to the charitable house fund as it was managed by the queen. The madam looked at the young lady with fury as she had made donations in her own name. She furiously attacked the young lady without asking why she had made the donation. She was shouting something, but being a mad girl, Ariadne smiled and said she had done everything to improve their family's reputation, and the queen publicly praised them for not forgetting those in need. The madam looked at the young lady with fury and asked how she dared to contradict her so arrogantly and insolently. In a fit of anger, she swung her hand at the young lady to hit her, but a moment later, the cardinal entered the room and called his wife. He looked at her with fury and shouted that he knew she would do something like this, and that is why he hurried towards them. He looked at her with fury and asked if she knew how many pairs of eyes were currently watching their home and family. He shouted that she should stop showing her greed, since the amount was very small. He shouted that she should not repeat the mistakes she had made, and she should not disgrace herself and be more modest. A moment later, the cardinal looked closely at his daughter and called her. He thought for a moment and asked if it was true. He understood that she was awarded the blue heart of the ocean depth. He looked closely at his daughter and said that they could open the box and look at the gift. The young lady slowly followed her father's request, and everyone was amazed by the beauty of this necklace. The cardinal looked at his daughter closely and said that she had no suitable place to keep it, and they could leave the stone in his office. He looked closely at his daughter and asked what she thought about it. The young lady in turn tensed up and looked closely at her father. He looked at her intently, waiting for an answer, The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to say. She knew she needed to stall for time. She was a little puzzled and worried, so she didn't understand why he hadn't arrived to them yet. She silently prayed for them to come to them quickly. The young lady looked intently at her father, and hesitating, muttered something incoherently. A moment later, someone knocked on their door, and everyone was a little surprised as they weren't expecting guests. The young lady in turn blossomed before our eyes as she knew what would happen next. A man entered the room and said that he had come to them on the orders of Her Majesty the Queen. He said that, on that day, by order of the king, a precious gift had been given to the young lady. He said that, for the convenience of storage, the Queen had sent them a forged chest, and it should be kept in the owner's chambers. He looked closely at everyone present and asked where they would like to put it. She said that her room was in the attic on the 3rd floor. Cardinal interrupted his daughter and cried out that this was not so. A moment later, he shouted to the young men to carry everything to the 2nd floor. To the westernmost door, Madame was in shock, as she did not expect anything like this from your husband. She looked angrily at her ledge and shouted that this was his eldest son's room. He looked at her intently and said that if they told it like it was, there would be ridiculous rumors that they had forced their daughter to live in the attic. He looked at her intently and asked if this was really what she wanted. The young lady in turn looked at them intently, as she knew that everything was going according to her plan. She walked towards her new room with a cheerful and playful smile. A moment later, she entered the room and saw that there wasn't even a study room there. She was surprised that her eldest son was using such a large space alone. She told the Queen that if she accepted the reward and returned home with it, she would no longer be hers. She asked the Queen to sign a receipt stating that she had donated all the money and that she would take it back when she needed it. And part of the money the Queen was to spend on buying a chest, which should be placed in her room. The young lady looked intently at the Queen and said that all she had to do was give the appropriate order for this. She used the charity house as if it were some kind of bank. She wasn't sure the Queen would give permission for this. And she was very surprised that the Queen gave her many gifts. In addition, thanks to her, she was able to protect the jewels from her sister. The young lady was very happy, as everything was resolved quickly and easily. A moment later, a maid entered the room and informed her mistress that another person from the royal palace had come to see her. She slowly handed her a small box and said that it was given to her from the palace. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to see anything else. When she opened the box, she froze in surprise as she noticed a small decoration and a small note. She slowly pulled out the note and began to read it. She looked at the small piece of paper in surprise, because now she understood who the gift was from, and she was happy about it. Sancha slowly prepared the young lady's bed. She smiled and said that the room was simply superb and majestic. She said with a beaming smile that the blanket was very soft and cozy. The young lady looked at her closely and said that she did not have to do it herself because she now had 2 new maids. Sancha looked closely at her mistress and asked how she could trust them. She did not understand how her mistress could entrust strangers with work on things that directly touched her body. She looked intently at the young lady and shouted that she even entrusted them with cleaning the office. Ariadne smiled and said that there was nothing to worry about. A moment later, they finished their dialogue as they heard someone knock on the door. They looked in surprise at the young lady who came to them. Ariadne did not expect at all that her sister would come to her. Arabella looked at her sister closely and said that she had not come to play with her. She looked closely at her sister and said that she would watch what else the clueless one would do. Ariadne looked closely at her younger sister as she noticed that she was bored, and that was why she came. She sighed heavily because she understood that in this house, Arabella had never been paid attention to. Ippolito was the only and eldest son. Isabella was the pride of her father and mother, who could be sold to a wealthy family. They both received the attention and love of the parents of the cardinal and Lucrezia. Meanwhile, little Arabella, like a child who failed to prove her worth to the family, became an outcast in her own home. The young lady looked at her sister intently, as she felt very sorry for her, and she thought that it would not hurt them to spend some time together. She looked at her intently and asked with a smile why she had brought the lute to them. She asked if sister really liked to play music. Arabella looked at her sister intently and said with a smile that she thought she didn't know it, but she played it brilliantly. Adriana looked at her sister intently and with surprise and said that perhaps she had a talent for playing musical instruments. Arabella said that she had a talent not only for this, since she also composed melodies well. The young lady looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she really wrote music. A moment later, Arabella began playing her melody with a smile. Ariadne looked at the young lady with admiration and asked in surprise if she had really come up with this herself. The maid smiled and said that the young lady was simply clever and that it was incredible on her part. The young lady smiled and said shyly that it was not very and incredible. One looked closely at her sister and said that if she had such talent, then she should ask her parents to buy her other instruments. She said that the organ would be much better suited for writing music. Arabella, after a little hesitation, said that she had wanted to remake the melody for the Mass, and therefore an organ would be more appropriate for such a task. But unfortunately, her mother said that such expenses for the sake of one girl were too expensive a pleasure. She was puzzled and said that unfortunately, no one would do it just for her, and sit down, Isabella would not use it, which meant no one would buy her anything. Ariadne looked at her sister in surprise and excitedly said that she could try just talk to her. She looked at Arabella and said that if she could persuade her sister, then perhaps her mother would also give her consent. The young lady froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Ariadne looked closely at her sister, as she realized that she most likely realized that she was less loved than Isabella. Ariadne sighed heavily. She was puzzled and did not understand why she even sympathized with a child whose situation was several times better than hers. She wondered who else should worry about whom in this situation. Sometime later, they were all sitting in class, each busy with his own task. Arabella looked timidly at her sister and said that she would like to talk to her about something. Isabella, without looking up from her mirror, asked her sister what she wanted. Arabella looked at her sister closely and asked if she could ask her mother to buy her an organ. Isabella sighed heavily and, looking at her reflection, told her sister that even if she needed it, it did not mean that others should and could acquire it at that moment. She said that extravagance was a bad trait, which did not suit a true lady of knowledgeable manners. Arabella was shocked by her sister's statement. She shouted that this was not just her whim, but that she would use it for good. Ariadne looked at them intently. She was a little surprised since Isabella said such things, even though she herself used expensive cosmetics and luxury items of unimaginable price. She was surprised since Isabella did not even blink an eye. She looked at her sister and said with a smile that the music written by Arabella was simply beautiful and that this was not a childish joke. Ariadne looked intently at her sister and with a smile asked her to play something for them. Arabella was surprised by such statements, but still agreed. A moment later, the young lady played them her song. Isabella looked at her sister in surprise and said that it seemed to be true. She asked her sister if she had really composed this piece herself. Arabella looked at her sister closely and said that she did everything herself. Isabella asked her sister where she would perform such a song. Arabella said that this melody was for the Mass, but it was not finished yet. Isabella walked slowly up to her sister and hugged her with a smile. She smiled and asked her sister if she wanted to talk about something just between them. Isabella smiled and asked her sister what she thought about it. Arabella asked Ariadne to leave the room. Ariadne, in turn, obediently did what she asked. Isabella looked at her sister and said with a smile that the status of a family is determined by the most capable and outstanding person in it. She asked her sister if she understood this. In other words, her reputation is the same as Arabella's reputation because they are sisters. Everyone slowly entered the church. They heard that today, one of the cardinal's daughters would present her composition for the Mass. They were surprised since it turns out they had many talents. They knew that one daughter was very religious and knew theology, and the other had the skill of composition. Everyone present admired the young ladies as they both stood out from their peers. The young lady, in turn, with a radiant smile, thanked everyone present for coming. A moment later, she saw the camellia, and with a smile, she said that they had come early. Camellia smiled and thanked Isabella for the invitation. Isabella smiled and said that this was her first composition of her own, and she simply could not help but invite a person who understood music so well. The rest looked at the young lady and said that it seemed that she had come with her fiancé. Isabella looked at the young man and said with a smile that she had missed him very much. He looked at her shyly and said with a smile that she was as beautiful as always. Camellia looked in surprise at the young people who were cooing and smiling right in front of her. A moment later, she looked at the young lady with fury, as she did not like this at all. The young man smiled, and looking at Isabella, said that he expected a lot from today's performance. Isabella thanked him with a smile. A moment later, she looked at everyone present, and with a beaming smile, said that they could begin. She looked closely at her sister, because she knew that Ariadne, unlike her, did not deserve any of the praise or attention that was bestowed upon her that day. She was a little nervous, but she knew that she would return everything to normal. She looked at her sister with mockery and contempt, as she wanted to return the glory that she had taken from her. Arabella, in turn, sat quietly in the hall. She was puzzled by everything that was happening. She was very happy because she knew that from now on, she would play the organ. She was glad that she finally had the opportunity to rewrite the melody for the Mass. She in turn was a little puzzled, since she did not understand how sister managed to achieve that which she could not. Ariadne looked closely at the young lady and congratulated her on having finally managed to obtain the coveted instrument. She looked at her closely and said that instead of persuading Isabella to help in the matter of buying it, she allowed her to take the score and put another name on it. Arabella in turn hesitated, but said nothing. Ariadne looked sideways at her sister and asked if she was glad that she got what she wanted. Arabella sighed heavily and said that she didn't know. She was puzzled. She told her that her sister had simply promised to help only on the condition that she would perform her music under her own name. She was confused and did not understand why her sister had done this. She sighed heavily and said that it was bad. Ariadne, in turn, looked intently at her sister, but did not answer. A moment later, she sighed heavily, and looking at her sister, said that not all people are kind and righteous. Arabella froze in place in surprise. She clenched her fists and said that Isabella was still her sister. She looked at her sister with fury and shouted that she could behave rudely and badly only towards Ariadne, but not towards her. Ariadne looked closely at her sister and asked her why she thought that, when Isabella said she wanted an organ, it was immediately bought, and her request was ignored. She said that her father and mother knew that her older sister was not interested in playing musical instruments. She asked her sister why the teacher did not structure the lessons in such a way as to develop her outstanding abilities, but at the same time adjusted to Isabella. She told her sister that if she remained silent, meekly accepted, and listened to everything, then no one would know about her bad deeds. Ariadne looked at her sister intently and said that this time Isabella simply stole her music. Arabella shouted at her sister to stop saying such things. She shouted angrily at her sister to stop and not to dare to say anything unnecessary anymore. Arabella told her sister to stop talking such nonsense and not to dare and slander her sister for being better in something. Arabella screamed that her mother and her sister loved her very much. She screamed with rage and tears in her eyes that the most important thing was that she was a real Damar. She screamed at her sister that she was just a fake. She was furious and was very hurt by her sister's words. The young lady sighed heavily, for she knew that her past self had also so stubbornly denied it, because by admitting such a thing, one could become aware of one's misfortune. She sighed heavily, knowing that this was all she could do for her sister. The young lady looked closely at everyone present, and with a radiant smile said that they could begin. Everyone looked at her intently, and a moment later, they were already listening to a beautiful composition. But a moment later, they froze in place with indignation. Arabella in turn froze in place from the silk. She was puzzled and did not understand what she had done. She was puzzled and wondered if she had mixed up the notes. The man looked sideways at the young lady and said that they had finished playing her piece, but there was one part in it that they did not understand. He looked at her closely and said that in the middle of the melody, the notes were placed illogically. He was a little puzzled and did not understand why they were in that particular place. The young lady smiled shyly and said that she just wanted to emphasize that part. He looked at her in surprise and said with a puzzled expression that this was quite a bold decision. He looked at her closely and said that if he played it correctly, this section would be difficult because the musicians would have to try hard to use it with one hand. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she could demonstrate to them how to play properly. Isabella froze in shock. She did not know what to do. She looked at the man with fury and asked if he was really suggesting that she do everything herself. Arabella was shocked as she understood that her sister did not know how to read notes at all, and there was no talk of performing. Isabella looked at the man with fury and asked if the recognized masters of their craft couldn't play a melody. She asked if their skills were really as high as everyone said. Arabella froze in place. She was very nervous, not knowing what to do. She was puzzled because she knew she had to help her sister in this situation. A moment later, she screamed and told them to wait a little. With lightning speed, the young lady snatched the notes from the man and said that in the final version, the introduction of the string instruments was accidentally omitted, therefore it was done unintentionally. She sighed heavily and corrected the notes, and said that even the most skilled musician could not play something like this, since a certain piece was missing in the part with string instruments. She quickly corrected everything and looked closely at everyone present. Everyone froze in shock on the spot and began to whisper, because they heard that Isabella herself said that it was her own work. They quietly whispered and said that they found it very strange that Isabella was so well versed in music. The young lady looked at Isabella with a smirk and said that it seemed obvious that she had stolen the composition from her own sister. She said that Isabella was simply a shameless girl. Isabella, in turn, looked at everyone present with her rage. She was puzzled and did not know how to get out of this situation. A moment later, Madame screamed and asked everyone to stop as some misunderstanding had arisen. She looked intently at everyone present and said, puzzled, that her daughters Arabella and Isabella wrote this melody together. The main melody was composed by her eldest daughter, and the younger one added the rest. She looked at everyone intently and cried out that Isabella had made a significant contribution to the works, and that she had written most of them, and therefore she would really not want any misunderstandings to arise and bad rumors to spread. A moment later, everyone turned and stared at the young man who was standing in the corner and laughing wildly. He looked at Madame and asked with a grin if she was telling the truth. Isabella was very surprised, as she did not expect such a reaction from the Count. The Count slowly approached the young lady, and taking her hand with tenderness and a grin, kissed her hand. He smiled and said that they had not met for a long time, and he called her the beautiful Isabella. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was as gorgeous as always. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment. He smiled and said that she lived up to her status as the capital's first beauty. The Count smiled and said that her best quality was her beauty. He came closer to her and quietly said that when a person tries to fit in and gain influence by wearing clothes that do not suit him at all, it looks very disgusting. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smirk that today was exactly what she did. Isabella froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect to hear anything like that from him at all. A moment later, she looked at him with fury and asked what he could know about someone else's life. Cesare looked at her with a grin and asked if he was wrong. Isabella shouted angrily that she didn't care about such things at all. He looked at the young lady intently and said with a grin that he had no intention of asserting anything against her, and yet she understood him from the first word. He looked at the young lady intently and said mockingly that she was so beautiful and also very smart. He smiled and said it was just incredible. He looked intently at everyone present and said with a grin that now they knew that the young lady also had an exceptional mind. Everyone present began to mock her. Isabella in turn looked at them with fury. She came closer to the Count and told him to listen to her. He looked at her intently and, pushing her away, said that he decided to come here to listen to good music, but became a witness to such an unexpected situation. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he thought he had seen enough today. Let him go first. He bowed to the young lady and asked permission to take his leave. He slowly left the room. All the men looked at the young lady with a grin. Isabella was puzzled as she saw everyone leaving the hall. A moment later, she screamed angrily at them to stop staring at her immediately. She screamed at them all to get out quickly. The young man looked at the Count and asked him to stop for a moment and listen. He asked the Count with a grin why he had decided to interfere in something like this. The Count looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he meant. He looked intently at the Count and said that it had only recently seemed to him that he had finally taken a liking to her. The Count looked at his friend in bewilderment and asked what he meant by that. He smiled and said that the young lady had a strong sense of self-worth. Considering her beautiful appearance, her narcissism was obvious and understandable. He looked at the Count and asked if he thought it would be expensive for him to win Isabella over again. He looked at the Count with a smirk and asked if he was sure that he could arrange something like that. He asked if he really had lost all interest in her. The Count looked at his friend with fury and asked since when should he express his opinion based on a woman's mood or judgment. The young man hesitated as he realized that he had made a mistake in saying such a thing. The Count sighed heavily and said that anyone who wanted to be near him had to be patient and wise enough not to open her mouth in vain, provoking him to speak unflatteringly. He sighed heavily and said angrily that his mood was spoiled, and therefore he wanted to have a little drink. He looked at his friends intently and said that he would go first, and that they would meet later at the agreed place. The young man sighed heavily and looked at the Count with bewilderment. He noticed that he was very hot-tempered. Madame stared intently and was puzzled, but she looked at her daughter, who was crying in the carriage. Isabella was in shock and did not understand how she could now appear in public. With tears in her eyes, she looked at her mother and asked if she had seen the Count, since he had a look of complete contempt. She was furious since others were looking at her sideways. She did not understand what to do if she began to be avoided in high society. The madam looked closely at her daughter and said that she was just a poor girl and asked her not to cry. Madame glanced sideways at her youngest daughter with fury. She came closer to her and angrily asked who allowed her to get involved in such a situation. Arabella hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She said, puzzled, that she just wanted to help her sister. She sighed heavily and, looking away, said that she simply could not allow the melody to be played with the wrong notes. Madame shouted angrily that whether the notes were right or wrong was of no importance. She shouted that now her sister's name was tarnished and rumors would spread throughout the kingdom in an instant. Isabella, with tears in her eyes, screamed that everything was exactly like that, and it was because of her that everyone would whisper nastily about her music. The young lady froze in shock and, looking at her sister, asked if it was really her music. Arabella looked at her sister in surprise and said that it was her melody. Isabella looked at her sister with fury and asked what she was talking about. Arabella shouted that it was she who wrote this composition. Sister simply took it away. Arabella fell to her knees and looked at her mother, saying that it was her melody and that sister had simply taken it away. She shouted to her mother that she simply had to know this, even if others did not know the truth. The madam looked at her daughter with fury and asked if she was really talking about her older sister now. Arabella froze in shock as she looked at her mother. She had not expected anything like this at all. Madame grabbed the young lady by the clothes with fury. She looked at her daughter with fury and a look of full contempt and said that their Isabella was the pearl of high society, a treasure that they were all proud of. She shouted with fury that she simply would not allow anyone to spoil this, and not even her wayward melodies. Taking the whip in her hands, she looked at her daughter intently and asked with fury if she realized her mistake. Arabella was in shock with tears in her eyes. She screamed that it was her sister's fault that she took away her music. She screamed that if she had not done it, then nothing would have happened. Madame looked at her daughter with fury and said to the man who waved the whip that it seemed she refused to admit her guilt. Arabella was in shock. She shouted to her mother that she was not at all guilty of this, but Madame did not listen to her and beat her. Some time later, the young lady slowly walked out of the room. She was trembling as her whole body ached from her mother's blows. She slowly walked back to her room while everyone was whispering behind her back. She hobbled because her legs hurt from the blows. Walking into the room, she accidentally bumped into her sister. Ariadne looked intently at the young lady and, opening her arms, told her to come to her. Arabella, with tears in her eyes, rushed to her sister and hugged her tightly. Ariadne, in turn, tenderly hugged her sister and quietly calmed her down. Some time later, the young lady received a letter inviting her to a salon for a display and evaluation of works of art. She knew that this was a great opportunity for her to expand her friendships. Sitting at the dining table, she read the invitation letter. Ariadne looked at the letter with confusion, because after reading it, she realized that the crown prince would be at this event. Isabella looked at her maid in surprise and asked if there was really only one invitation. The maid sighed heavily and said that that was exactly it. Isabella, in turn, looked at her satisfied sister with anger. She looked at her sister with a smirk and asked if she would really go to this event with the Marquise. Isabella looked at her sister with a smirk and told her not to think badly of her. The young lady herself should understand perfectly well that she never had the chance to perform in society as she should. Isabella said, young lady, that before the debut, it is not proper for them to go out into society without an escort. Ariadne looked closely at her sister as she finally said something sensible. Ariadne looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that she was completely right. Isabella looked at her in surprise as she did not expect to hear something like that. The cardinal looked closely at his daughter and said that he thought it was time to introduce their youngest daughter to the whole society. Madame froze in shock looking at her husband. The young lady in turn was surprised and embarrassed as she understood that this would be her debut. Isabella looked at her father excitedly as she did not expect anything like this at all. She looked closely at her father and asked if her sister could hold her own ball. She knew that the ballroom season was over for this year. Every year, with the arrival of spring, as soon as the flowers bloomed, young girls and boys from noble families were invited to the palace for special events to greet the king and queen. If a debutante cannot appear due to travel or illness, a separate ball is held in order to make a name for themselves in social circles. This is one of the privileges that the most noble people can enjoy. The young lady looked at her father with excitement and asked if he would really do such a thing for Ariadne. He looked closely at his daughter and said that Ariadne was also capable of raising the family's name in society. Looking at his daughter, he said that after the debutante ball, her freedom of action would increase and she would be able to do much more. The young lady in turn froze in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Isabella was furious. She understood that she would hardly be able to stop her father, but she knew that in this case she had to prevent her sister from visiting the Marquise's salon. She looked closely at her father and said with a smile that it was not right for her sister to attend such events alone. She said that even if they started preparing for the ball now, no matter how much they rushed, it was already autumn outside, and until then, she would not be able to go to the salon without a guardian. Madame looked intently at the cardinal and called him. She sighed heavily and said that she had been feeling a little sick lately to go there. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she should call the doctor to examine her. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked what she had done to make her sick. Ariadne looked closely at her parents and asked how they could ask to take her to this event when her mother was in such a bad condition. She sighed heavily and said that it would only be in her interests. Isabella looked at her sister with a grin and said that she was very sorry that this time she would not be able to attend this event, and it was very annoying because the prince himself would be there. Ariadne looked at her sister with a smile and said that she was not at all sorry. The maid looked closely at her mistress and said with a smile that she was very glad that she would be able to visit the salon because the prince himself would be there. She looked closely at the young lady and said that in that case, she should have dressed nicer. The maid looked intently at the young lady and continued to talk non-stop about young guys in a crazy way. The young lady looked at her maid with a smile, but in turn, she was very glad that they still managed to go to the salon. Ariadne looked closely at Madame and with a radiant smile asked if she could accompany her to the salon as a guardian. Madame agreed with a smile. She knew that she needed to buy several paintings at the auction, as today there would be a new artist's works on display, the price of which would increase greatly next year, and in a few years, he would become famous among the lords of the era. For this reason, she wanted to buy his paintings in advance. But in turn, she knew that the most important thing was that Vittoria Nica would be there. A statue of Nike, the goddess of victory, which is highly valued for its artistry and good preservation. The aristocrat who bought the statue in his past life displayed it in the mansion's palace to show off his treasure. Some time later, part of Halicardote's travel notes was discovered. He wrote that its fragile wing, after a series of damages, could not be restored, so the statue was exhibited without one wing. Unfortunately, the head and left hand disappeared somewhere, and this image of the goddess became a symbol of her painful struggle victory in the Celle-Spontine War and overcoming all the horrors of those days. And for this reason, it was decided to preserve the statue in a dilapidated state. In other words, the sculpture that the aristocrat acquired was a fake. She knew that in a past life, when the residents learned of the deception, the talk in the capital did not stop for some time. Even scientists were excited by the question of the authenticity of this creation. She knew he was finally going to see something interesting, and was glad that this whole situation had nothing to do with her. A moment later, everyone present was informed that the cardinal's second daughter had arrived. Everyone was whispering that the young lady was not as beautiful as her sister, but she was very charming and sweet. They said that she was a half-breed. The young lady in turn walked proudly despite all the rumors. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that she was already used to being alone all the time. She was puzzled by the fact that in her past life, everything was exactly like this. She decided not to pay attention to everything and go and have some snacks. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard the prince being introduced. The young lady looked closely at the young prince, who was smiling and talking to everyone. She knew she didn't belong there. She decided to stay in the garden for a while before the auction started. She didn't want the prince to see her alone. She knew she looked very ridiculous right now, and she didn't want him to see her in this state. Moments later, the prince left everyone present and with a cry called out to the young lady. Ariadne, in turn, froze in place in surprise, since she did not expect anything like this from the prince. He ran up to her with lightning speed and said with a radiant smile that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The young lady's expression changed with lightning speed, and she greeted the prince with a radiant smile. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he must have had a hard time. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was not so. A moment later, the young lady laughed. He looked closely at her radiant smile. Walking through the garden, the prince said with a smile that he did not think that they would see each other today. He looked at her in surprise and asked how they let her go. He thought that most likely she arrived at this event with her mother. She smiled and said that Madame Romani was with her today as her guardian. She is their teacher. He smiled and said that it was very good. He asked with a smile how she liked today's outfit. She smiled and said that she liked it much more than the previous one. He looked at her in surprise and asked where the hairpin he had sent her was. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she said with a smile that the hairpin was very beautiful. She said with a smile that unfortunately it didn't go with her outfit today, but she would definitely wear it next time. He smiled and said that he would look forward to that moment. She knew that it was not at all proper for her to say that that hairpin was absolutely not to her taste. They walked along the path for a while and chatted pleasantly, but a moment later, the young lady looked intently at something in the distance and admired the view. She looked at the prince with a smile and called him. She said that they just had to go there. The prince froze in surprise. He could not take his gaze off the lady. He agreed with her and slowly walked up to the young lady, who was absorbed in the sight of the beautiful flowers. They wandered leisurely among the beautiful flowers, and the young lady was delighted with them as she had never seen anything like them before. The prince walked slowly with the young lady and looked at the beautiful flowers. He realized that they were walking in rather dense vegetation, and from the outside, it was not obvious that they were alone here. He stood there embarrassed as he realized that they were the only two there. He looked intently at the young lady who was admiring the beautiful flowers. He threw all his thoughts away, as he knew that they must be thinking about such things. After all, they were just friends. He slowly approached her and asked with a smile if she wanted this flower. The young lady in turn looked closely at the flower and sighed heavily and said that all these flowers belonged to the marquise. She did not know if it was allowed to just pick them. He looked at her closely and said with a soft smile that they could do it in secret from everyone. The young lady in turn laughed shyly, looking at the prince. She smiled and said that she couldn't sneak them in unnoticed, and she didn't want to pick and just throw away such a lovely flower. He smiled and said that she could hide the beautiful flower in the hem of her skirt. The young lady laughed in turn, and the prince looked closely at her radiant smile. A moment later, he called her, and with the speed of lightning, lifted her into his arms. The young lady in turn froze in surprise on the spot, as she did not expect such a thing from the prince. She cried out in embarrassment and called him, but he only said with a smile that she should quickly pick the flower. The young lady in turn looked intently at the prince, but still obeyed his command. A moment later, she plucked a beautiful flower. Looking at the prince, she said that he was very handsome. The prince looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and agreed with her. The man looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that the Marquis and his wife had prepared this wonderful event, and His Highness the Prince was their guest today. He expressed his sincere gratitude to everyone present for coming to this event. He said with a smile that his name was Vincentio, and that he had come to them from the Republic of Porto. The young lady in turn looked closely at all the exhibits. She realized that all the aristocrats had gathered in one place for the sake of one exhibit. A moment later, the man showed everyone a beautiful painting by the new artist. He announced the price of this exhibit with a radiant smile. He was a little surprised and puzzled because after he announced the price, there was silence in the room. A moment later, the young lady decided to buy the painting and offered a price. He looked at the young lady in surprise with a smile on his face. He looked at everyone present with a smile and asked who would offer more than her price. The young lady in turn looked intently at everyone present. She knew that, while this master was not so well known throughout the world, no one showed interest in his works, but in a few years, he would become the chosen artist of the head church. She knew it was natural that others were not willing to buy his work these days. A moment later, the young lady froze in place in surprise as she heard someone offer more than the appointed amount. She turned around angrily because she wanted to see the man who had set the price. The man looked into the hall with a smile and asked which gentleman had just shouted out his bet. The man looked intently into the hall and said with a smile that it looked like it was the count. The young lady in turn looked at the young count with fury. He turned around and nodded back at her with a grin, and she froze in place. She glared at him, gritting her teeth, as she realized his gaze was very familiar to her. She knew that with his gaze, he demonstrated a new interest in something that had previously been indifferent to him. A moment later, the young lady raised her price because she wanted to get her hands on the piece. The man looked closely at everyone present and asked with a smile if there were any others who would like to purchase the painting. No one wanted to buy this painting. The man smiled and said that the young lady had purchased it a moment later. She sighed heavily because she knew that, although she had purchased it at a higher price than she had expected one way or another, she had achieved the purpose of her visit. She smiled, knowing that she could now watch the fool's race with peace of mind. The Count looked at the young lady with bewilderment. A moment later, the man looked intently at everyone present and with a smile presented them with the next lot. The young lady looked intently at everyone present while enjoying her dessert. Everyone was whispering as they were delighted with such an ancient creation, which they were lucky enough to see in their days, and what's more, in good condition. The man smiled and said that each of them had an idea of the value of the entire work, and if they did not need his explanations a moment later, he said that they could begin the bidding. The young lady looked closely at everyone present, as she knew that in her past life, a marquise and an earl had taken part in the bidding for her. She knew that many years had passed since then, and she could no longer remember who else wanted to buy this statue. A moment later, she heard someone place a bet. She turned around and froze in place as she realized that it was the prince himself. She was shocked and didn't understand why he got involved in something like this. A moment later, she noticed that the Count had placed a larger bet. She sighed heavily, as she was already afraid that the prince would buy a fake. But a moment later, the prince made a bigger bet. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing from him. For some time, the Count and the prince competed, placing big bets between themselves. The prince, sighing heavily and unable to bear it, made a big bet. The young lady, in turn, was very angry and understood that she simply could not allow him to buy this work. She was furious and whispered quietly that she simply couldn't let him buy it. The Count looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why the last bet could not be left to the prince. The young lady turned around in surprise and looked intently at the young man. She asked what he was talking about. A moment later, he said out loud that the young lady was saying that this statue should not be purchased. She froze in shock. He looked closely at the man and asked what he would say about this. Turning around, she noticed that everyone had started whispering. She looked closely at the young man and wondered if he had gone crazy. The man looked at them in surprise and asked, puzzled, where they got such ridiculous thoughts from. Cesare sighed heavily and asked how he could know. He said that he thought he would find the answer to his question in the young lady. Cesare sighed and asked if she could notice that the statue was a fake. The young lady froze in shock. She was puzzled, looked at the Count, and said that she did not even understand what he was talking about now. He said in a calm manner that the young lady told him that it was a fake. Ariadne was shocked. She looked intently at the young man and shouted that it was a blatant lie on his part. The man was shocked. He screamed and told the young lady that she must be responsible for her words. She really wanted to burst into tears and scream that they disgusted her. She wanted to tell them that she was such a young person, that much was still unknown. She sighed heavily and looked at everyone present with a puzzled expression, as she would have liked to scream just like that, but unfortunately, she couldn't afford it. She sighed heavily and wondered if she left this meeting, the prince would take the solution to the problem upon himself. She thought about the price for a moment. She didn't think that the bet would plunge the prince into poverty, but still, when it was revealed that he had purchased a fake, then the prince's good name would probably be disgraced. She sighed heavily because she knew that the most important thing in this situation was not to let the prince be made a laughingstock. The young lady sighed and, slowly shaking her dress, stood up and walked away. Moments later, she shouted at the man that he didn't seem to be a very experienced antique dealer. She screamed and asked if he thought the statue was authentic. He looked at the young lady with fury and indignation and shouted that she was certainly genuine, and by all accounts, he had brought her to auction. He shouted that she was simply not a smart girl. The young lady looked at the man intently and recited to him a small passage from Elenia's travel notes, Halicardota. He looked at her closely and said that her words were trusted, but there was also mention of the subsequent restoration of the wing. He shouted that he saw nothing wrong with its restoration. He shouted that the restoration was carried out in ancient times and the value of the statue should not be underestimated. The young lady, in turn, slowly approached the young man. He looked at her in surprise and whispered with a smile, was she really asking him for a sword? She sighed heavily and said that she was not asking for this at all, since she knew that he still carried a baton with him. He looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not understand how she found out about this. He slowly handed her the baton. The young lady looked at the man intently and said that no matter how much you try to pick up a broken cup, it will never stop being broken. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew this proverb. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really picking on the fact that the collapsed wing had been restored. He said that it had been restored in ancient times, and the traces of the transformation had the same historical value. She looked at him intently and asked if he admitted that the wing had once been destroyed. The man was shocked. He shouted that it was a well-known fact. She looked at him intently and said that in that case, if the broken cup falls, it will break again in exactly the same places. The man froze in surprise and shock. A moment later, the young lady swung her baton. Everyone froze in shock. The man didn't have time to say anything. A moment later, the statue flipped over and fell to the ground with a loud crash. The lady looked closely at everyone present and said that the previously damaged wing should have broken on impact in the same way as before. She said that this stone statue looked as if it had been recently opened. The man shouted angrily. He was beside himself with anger and did not understand what the young lady was allowing herself to do. He asked in a dull voice if she had really gone mad. With that lightning, the young lady put a club to the man's throat. She looked at the man closely and asked if he was sure that this statue was the original. Everyone started whispering and saying that the man seemed to be a swindler. The young man slowly approached them, looked closely at everyone present, and said that he had one more question. He looked at the man closely and asked with a grin if it was true that he was Vincenzo Del Cato. The man ran towards the exit with lightning speed. Everyone present shouted after him that he was a fraud. Cesare looked at the young lady with a smirk, as he had helped her in some way, but she in turn looked at him with fury. Everyone was delighted that the young lady and the count did not stand aside and distinguished themselves at this event. They were surprised, because they knew that such young ladies did not behave in such a way. They said that it seemed that she had special eyes. She looked at the count with fury and asked what he was thinking. Ariadne asked with fury how one could push another person to lie without considering the consequences. He looked at her closely and with a beaming smile said that everything ended well and she didn't need to worry so much about something like that. The lady looked at the count with fury, but he did not answer. She looked at him intently and said that he was talking as if he were talking to a friend. She asked in surprise if they were really that close to each other. He looked at her intently and with an innocent smile told her that she should be quieter. He smiled and said that he didn't remember her debut, which meant that she was still a child. He smiled and asked where it had ever been seen that children told adults how to talk to them. He smiled and said with a grin that she looked very cute in a yellow baby dress. She looked at him with fury. A moment later, she told the count everything she was thinking. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she should already understand that he was not as irresponsible as he might seem to her at first glance. He said that he had previously been told that the real Vincentio had been found dead. She looked at the young man with fury and asked why he had not settled this issue himself and dragged her into an unpleasant situation. He sighed heavily and said that she already knew what position he was in, and if he dared to use his power as the king's illegitimate son to interfere in affairs, then he would lose his head. She looked at him with fury and shouted that if that was the case, then he should have stayed out of it. He looked at the young lady intently and sighed heavily as he said that he had come all this way just to meet her on a special matter. The young lady in turn froze in surprise and looked intently at the young man. She did not at all expect to hear anything like this from him. He slowly approached her even closer and said that his essence was very simple. He came even closer to her and quietly whispered in her ear that she should tell him her price. He wanted her to sell the blue heart of the ocean depths. The young lady froze in place from shock and surprise, as she did not expect anything like this at all. She looked at him furiously and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked if she had ever heard of Linville's swan. Ariadne was taken aback and stood frozen in place. He looked at her intently and said that this was one of the most valuable diamonds he owned, and he would discreetly exchange it for the blue heart of the ocean depths and give her another 6,000 ducats on top. The young lady was furious as she knew well about this diamond. She knew that this diamond was popularly known as a gift of true love. In her past life, she had been madly waiting to receive it from a young man. She was furious because she understood that in this life she would not sacrifice her youth. She would not kill anyone and risk herself. She looked intently at the young man who was looking at her with a smirk on his face. She looked at him in surprise. She was very hurt because she understood that he himself came to her in order to hand the diamond right into her hands. She looked at him intently with a smirk on her face, and a moment later asked him if he really thought that His Majesty had given her the most precious sapphire for such a constant purpose as sale or exchange. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady looked at the young man with fury and said that the blue heart of the ocean depths treasure, received as a gift from their king, they stone cannot be bought for any money. She looked at him with fury and said that apparently he was not given the ability to see the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, what should be owned and what should not. With the speed of lightning, she turned away from him and finally said that he should come to his senses already. The young man looked at her with fury and shouted for her to stop immediately. With the speed of lightning, he caught her by the hand and asked her angrily if she had suddenly gone deaf. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect anything like this from him, but still shouted for him to let her go immediately. She was trembling as she was in great pain from the fact that he squeezed her wrist very tightly. He looked at her with fury and asked what she had just said. The young lady in turn shouted again for him to let her go. A moment later, the prince approached them and shouted at the young man to release the young lady immediately. The count looked intently at his brother, but said nothing to him and did not let go of the young lady. The prince looked at him with fury and said that he apparently had not heard. He repeated to the count once again that he should immediately let go of the young lady's hand. The prince looked at the young man with fury and asked if he had forgotten that he should show respect to members of the royal family. Cesare looked at the prince with fury, as he did not want to do anything like that at all. Without letting go of the hand, the young man bowed to the prince. The prince, in turn, looked intently at the young man, as he saw that he did not want to let go of the young lady's hand. He slowly approached the count and said that this was a very ignorant greeting on his part. Alfonso said that it was more suitable for people whom they had met before. The prince said with a grin that they had met here for the first time today. The count looked at the prince with fury, for he understood what he had to do. A moment later, the count released the young lady's hand and bowed to the prince. Biting his lips, he greeted the crown prince with fury. Alfonso looked at his brother intently, but said nothing. A moment later, his expression changed, and looking at the young lady with a radiant smile, he said that this was the second time they had met today. He smiled and said that the Marquis and his wife were still waiting for them, and he believed that they should not upset them any further with their lateness. While the prince told the young lady this information, the count was on his knees. The prince smiled and told the young lady that he would accompany her, as he also needed to go that way. The prince glanced sideways at the count and said with a smile that he was glad to meet him. He smiled and said that they would meet him next time. Cesare was beside himself with anger. He did not answer the prince. The young lady turned around with a smile and told the count that he still had to pay for the broken floor where the statue had fallen. The young man stood up with the speed of lightning and shouted angrily after the young lady. He shouted that she was just a small snake. Some time later, the young lady and the prince were walking leisurely. The prince looked at the lady with admiration and said with a smile that she was simply magnificent. He was very surprised as he was perplexed. He could not understand how she realized that this status was fake. She smiled and, looking away from him, said that she had simply guessed. She said that the most important thing was that everything ended well. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that she should have at least hinted to him that this statue was a fake and he would not have spent money on it. She smiled and said that unfortunately she did not know the prince's intentions. A moment later, they both laughed, amused by the situation. He looked at her intently and asked excitedly how she had decided to break it if she was not completely sure that she was right. She froze for a moment from this question, since she did not expect to hear something like this. A few minutes later, she looked away sheepishly and said that she was only trying to protect someone. The prince froze in place in shock and surprise, not expecting to hear anything like this. He looked closely at the young lady and wondered if it was possible that he had become even a little bit special to her. She looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that thanks to her help, he had saved several thousand, and she hoped that he would repay her in kind. He looked at her in surprise and with an innocent smile asked how he could repay the young lady for her service. She smiled and said that he could spend several thousand ducats. He smiled and said that it seemed that she was the real swindler. The young lady looked at the prince with a smile and said that instead of money, he would later fulfill her wish. He looked at her with a surprised smile and asked what wish she wanted. Ariadne smiled and said that she herself did not know now, but one day, at the most important moment, she would definitely tell her about her wish. The prince looked at the young lady with a beaming smile and said that he would wait for this moment. A few minutes later, he sighed heavily and said that he thought it was time to return. Ariadne said goodbye to the prince. She sighed heavily as she realized that they were parting again for a long time. She wondered when she would have the opportunity to meet him again. A moment later, she heard the prince calling her. She froze in surprise. The prince smiled and said that she was writing her a letter and would certainly wait for an answer. Ariadne froze in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him, but a moment later, she agreed with him with a radiant smile. The cardinal looked closely at the young lady and said that her mother was originally supposed to handle the matter, but he had decided to entrust it to her. He looked at her intently and said that she would organize the ball for her debut herself. The young lady was shocked. He looked at her intently and said that her budget would be 150 ducats. She froze in surprise as she had not expected such a thing. He looked at her closely and told her that she should use the money wisely when she took up preparation. The young lady was shocked as she understood that the amount was very small. She knew that this amount was even less than half of what was spent in the budget. She sighed heavily, but still agreed with her father. She knew that there was nothing problematic in this, since she was quite skilled in these matters, and her past experience in managing the royal palace would be miraculously useful to her in this situation. She thanked her father with a grin. Some time later, the Viscount was having tea. The lady looked at Isabella and asked if she liked today's tea. She smiled and said that it was quite good. She smiled and told Isabella to try some of the delicious cookies as well. Isabella frowned sadly and said that she only eats cookies brought from the kingdom of Caligo. She sighed heavily as this tea party was very tiring for her. The Viscount's daughter was taken aback and said that she had completely forgotten about it and asked the servants to bring cookies delivered straight from the kingdom. The man looked intently at the young lady and said that he would do everything now. Isabella looked closely at the young man. As she noticed that he was not bad-looking, she sighed heavily and became thoughtful, for she realized that he was very attractive, but still of ignoble blood, and in all respects he was useless to her. She wondered if there was nothing more interesting here than triviality. A moment later, she looked closely at the young lady, as she noticed that she was quite attractive. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at the young man, as he was very handsome. Isabella looked at the young lady in surprise, and said that it seemed that she was looking at the servant in the presence of the groom. The young lady was taken aback and asked when she had ever looked at someone. The young man looked at his bride with fury. She was taken aback and called her fiancé, but Isabella interrupted her and called him. She touched his face tenderly and told him not to worry about it. She looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that she thought the young lady was lucky to have a groom like him, but she didn't say so. He stood there looking at the beautiful young lady, embarrassed, as he didn't expect to hear anything like that from her. She touched his face tenderly and quietly told him to call her by her first name. She looked at him with a gentle smile and said that she wanted to be addressed by her first name, not her last name. He looked at the young lady with embarrassment and timidity and asked if she really thought he could address her in such a way. His bride looked at them with fury. The young lady was shocked by what Isabella was doing. Isabella, in turn, looked intently at the lady, as was expected of her. She looked at everyone present with a smile, because she alone knew that she was still the most desirable girl in the kingdom. A moment later, a maid came up to them and announced that Miss Julia de Baldassare, the Marquise's daughter, had arrived. The young lady greeted the young lady with a smile. Isabella, in turn, looked at the lady with fury. Everyone ran up to the young lady with lightning speed. Isabella was furious and wondered how she was any worse than some Marquise's daughter. She was furious because she understood that they addressed her by her first name only because of her noble status, but they continued to call her by her last name. Only high-born nobles were addressed by their first name, and Isabella was closer to the commoners. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that years would pass, and after the death of her father, her brother would inherit the family name. She knew that she had only one path, by following which she could enjoy the honors to the fullest. She understood perfectly well that she must become the crown princess. She knew that in order to stand proudly under her name, she would use everything just to take a place of honor. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily as she knew that preparing a ball for an amount that was even less than half of the consumption budget was quite difficult. A moment later, a maid knocked on her door and said with a smile that Mrs. Marini from the atelier had arrived to see her. Some time later, they began taking measurements. The madam looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had quite pleasant features and that she only needed to apply some makeup and she would become simply irresistible. The young lady in turn looked intently at Madame and said that she needed a simple cut outfit so that everything would look decent. She said that there should be no exposed skin or complex decorations, and it would be wiser to cover the collarbones with the neckline of the dress. Ariadne understood perfectly well that if she made the neckline very deep, they would all certainly say that it was indecent, and they would call the excess luxury vulgar. She was furious because in her current life, she did not want to hear such things addressed to her. The madame and the maid shouted in one voice that this would not do. The young lady froze in surprise. Madame shouted that it was not proper to completely cover the voluminous upper part of the body, and that a properly cut neckline in the dress would help one look slimmer. Sancha told the lady that she had very beautiful collarbones and also a small face. The madam looked at the maid and asked with a smile if she really had the skills of a tailor. She smiled and said that this was just her modest knowledge. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she finally agreed with them. She looked at them intently and said that since they were so ardently trying to convince her otherwise, she had no choice but to agree. They were very glad that everything had turned out the way they wanted. Madame looked closely at the young lady, and with a satisfied smile told her to just trust her, and she would make her the most beautiful debutante at the ball. She looked intently at the young lady and said that she would be so dazzling that her partner would not be able to take his gaze off her. Ariadne froze for a moment as she completely forgot about her partner. When she thought about a partner, a prince immediately came to her mind. With lightning speed, she threw all thoughts away because she realized that the prince was playing such a role. It was simply absurd. She sighed heavily and decided to pull herself together a little, as she knew that this simply would not be possible to implement. The young man looked at her intently and said with a grin that he would be her partner at the ball. He smiled and introduced himself, saying that his name was Genobe de Rossi. The madam looked at the young lady with a smile and said that since she had no acquaintances from a noble family, she invited one of her family members. The young man slowly looked at the mansion. A moment later, he said that it was a very magnificent residence. He looked closely at his aunt and asked if she had really been living in a house full of luxury all this time. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the young man with a puzzled expression. She greeted him. With the speed of lightning, the young man approached her with a smile, stroked her head. He smiled and said that it seemed that she was his partner. A moment later, he smiled and touched her nose. She froze in shock on the spot, not knowing how to react to this. He said with a smile that he was leading very well. Therefore, she did not need to worry, and she could just trust him. Ariadne froze in shock, but she did not expect anything like this at all. She did not know what to do. She looked at the young man with contempt. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she was indeed tall. He asked in surprise if she, being tall, really wore high-heeled shoes. He looked casually at the young lady and, sighing heavily, said that he would give her one piece of advice and therefore she should listen carefully. He said that recently girls wear high heels to stand out without any regard for their partner. He said that a woman is able to attract attention to the man next to her, standing out from everyone thanks to her impressive beauty. Ariadne froze in shock as he was talking complete nonsense. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that on the day of the ball she should wear flat shoes. He looked at her intently and said with a satisfied smile that in this way she would demonstrate her wisdom. She froze in place with indignation, but in turn she did not answer him. Some time later, she left the room with her maid. She sighed heavily and said with cold anger that she could endure many things, but not this. The maid sighed heavily and told her mistress that she completely agreed with her. After a while, she said that there would be only one solution. The maid supported her mistress. A moment later, the young lady said angrily that she had to ask him as she no longer had a choice. Some time later, the young man sat quietly in his office and wrote a letter to his girlfriend with a tender smile. After she received the letter, she began to write him a reply. The young lady in turn wrote to the prince as she wanted to know whether he could be her partner at the upcoming Kabbalah. He wrote that she need not bother herself with wasting time on such questions, and she should only write the date and place. She was very surprised by his answer. The young lady knew that no one had ever shown unconditional favor to her before. Despite her self-sacrifice, she was only being used for their own purposes. She was puzzled and wondered if he could accept the young prince's kindness. Madame glanced sideways at her son and said that the young lady was throwing a celebratory banquet this time in honor of her debut. She said that she had heard that her partner was Lucretia's nephew. The lady looked at her son with a grin and said that it was obvious that he was the most ordinary man. She looked closely at her son and said that from any angle you looked at him, he could look better. She looked at the young man and asked if she was right. He sighed heavily and, looking at his mother, said that he knew her thoughts. He said that it would be better for them to change the topic of their conversation. She looked at him intently and told him not to be stubborn at all and to listen to her words, since in order to take the throne, he needed a wife who was famous for her favor and whose name was on everyone's lips. He sighed heavily and said that he had already asked her to stop. He looked at his mother with fury and shouted that she was not even a princess with the right of inheritance. He asked if she was really saying that he should marry her, and the throne would fall right into his hands. He looked at his mother with anger and said that, besides, that girl was like a small mouse with a bad temper. The madam looked at her son in surprise and sighed heavily, asking what kind of pathetic sight this was. She was watching him now. She said that he himself was not able to melt the heart of some girl, and now he was grumbling at his dearly beloved mother. She asked with disdain how helpless he was. He sighed heavily and said that whatever the case, he did not want to sign up as her partner. He shouted that it would be better for him to die, but he would not go. She looked at him with fury and said that it seemed like he was so scared that he wouldn't even try to take a risk. She shouted that he was a loser. The young man was furious because he didn't expect to hear such a thing from his mother. A moment later, he took his things and decided to leave the room. Madame looked at her son with fury as she noticed that he decided to show her his bad temper. She was furious as he wanted to die rather than listen to his mother. She asked angrily if he thought she couldn't get her way. Madame said with fury that in her entire life, she had never missed a single chance and had always gotten what she wanted. Isabella looked at her maid in surprise and asked if she was sure of this information. She excitedly asked the maid if she had really ordered the outfit from that workshop. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that she had heard that Madame Marini from the sewing workshop had come to see her in person. The young lady sighed heavily and wondered if her sister was really that self-confident. She was puzzled and knew that since her sister was also born ugly, then at least the outfit should have been ordered from the best workshop. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, but said with a smile that it was to her advantage. The young lady looked at her maid in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. She smiled and said that the girl in the white dress would shine brighter than everyone else. The young lady looked at Madame intently and asked if she had any fabrics in a lighter shade, such as white or cream. Madame looked at the young lady with excitement and said that they were choosing an outfit for her younger sister's debut, and according to tradition at the ball, only the debutante and her partner wear white clothes. Isabella looked at Madame with fury, for she knew that it would be better for her to silently follow her instructions and not interfere. For a moment. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the young lady said, with an innocent smile on her face, that it was her sister's whim and that she really wanted to dress up together for the ball in the same white dresses, and she told her that this should not be done, but the sister did not listen to her. Madame looked at the lady in bewilderment. She looked closely at Madame and said with a smile that she and her sister were very close. She looked closely at her maid and said that it went without saying that wherever she went, she would look more beautiful than the others. However, the young lady was a little puzzled and did not know if there was a way in which she could stand out from the crowd and become even more beautiful. The maid looked at her mistress and said that they could spill wine on her dress on the day of the ball. Isabella said that then everyone would think her very unhappy and begin to sympathize with the young lady. A moment later, she said with a smile that she had thought of something. She said that perhaps the young lady would have a breast pocket too. The maid looked closely at her mistress and said that it was quite possible because she had seen her sister take out the calico to wash. She said that this fabric is used just for the breast pocket. The young lady said with a grin that she had one brilliant idea. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that everything was ready. She looked at the beautiful lady with admiration. Sancha looked at her mistress with a smile and said that she could not understand what was shining more, her outfit or she. Ariadne smiled and told her maid that if she continued to flatter her, she could deceive her into thinking that she was really beautiful. After a while, the young lady was taken aback, and looking at the maid said that the outfit was terribly uncomfortable in the chest area. She asked the maid if she was sure that both the hall fabric was as usual. She asked her maid to make it a little looser there. The maid smiled and said that she had tied it looser than usual in order to show off her figure. She did not understand why the young lady constantly hid her beautiful breasts. Sancha said that Maria told her that she had a very good thing, and she immediately decided to try it out. She smiled and said that she decided to use hooks and sewed them onto the fabric because she thought they would add convenience when using the breast pocket, and now there was no need to fasten the fabric, and the knots were not visible at all. The young lady looked closely at the maid and asked if it was true. Sancha said with a smile that Marie had a head on her shoulders and that this idea was very good. The maid was taken aback and said that she had not come up with anything at all. A moment later, there was a knock at the door, and the young lady was informed that her partner had arrived. She looked in the mirror with lightning speed, for she knew that the prince himself had come to see her. She looked at everyone present with a smile and asked if it was time for them to go out into the world. Opening the door, she looked at the handsome prince with a smile. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he had been waiting for her for a long time. He smiled and said that it was not so, since he himself had only recently arrived. He looked closely at the young lady and with a radiant smile said that she was simply beautiful today and graceful like a queen from a legend. She in turn froze in place from embarrassment. With the speed of lightning, the young lady turned her embarrassed gaze away from the prince and said that it was not at all proper for him to say what was not in his heart. He looked intently at the young lady and said that he was not lying and she was truly beautiful. A moment later, they laughed, looking at each other. Their sweet dialogue was interrupted by a young man who rushed into the room and shouted that he had come to see her. The young man froze for a moment as he saw his companion with another young man. He was shocked and did not understand what this meant. He looked intently at the prince and asked where she found such a cute boy. He looked at the prince with fury. Alfonso, in turn, did not answer the young man. He asked with a satisfied smile if he knew that a man should be famous not for his beauty, but for his skills. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that she had followed another, forgetting about her handsome knight. A moment later, he turned around and shouted that he had told her not to wear high heels, but she had disobeyed him. He shouted that these were not empty words, and therefore she should change her shoes immediately. The prince grabbed the young man's hand in anger. He looked at him intently and said that there was no point in this, since she did not need his escort today. He looked at the prince with fury because he did not understand how he dared to treat him like that. He pounced on him with fury and shouted that now he would find out who was in front of him. With the speed of lightning, the prince drew his sword and put it to the young man's throat. He looked at the young man with fury and told him to stop talking nonsense. A moment later, he fell to the ground with a crash, and looking at the prince, asked if he had gone mad. He was furious and did not understand how the prince dared to put a sword to his throat without knowing who he was. The young lady sighed heavily, but said nothing. A moment later, she slowly approached the young man and said with a grin that she would now introduce her companion. She smiled and said that in front of him now was their second son, the crown prince. The young man froze in shock and looked at them, asking what they were talking about. A moment later, he bowed low and introduced himself, saying that he was very pleased to welcome the lesser light to their kingdom. Trembling with fear, he said that he could never have even thought that a prince was in front of him. Trembling, he repented and asked the prince for forgiveness since a mistake had occurred. He asked for mercy. The prince looked at the young man with anger and asked if he was really asking for forgiveness. After only just learning that he was the crown prince, he was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Alfonso looked at him with contempt and said that not only had he threatened a good and innocent girl, but he had also dared to attack a man whom he had never seen before. The prince looked closely at the young man and asked if he would repent of such conversations with any other interlocutor. He looked at him with fury and told him to apologize to the young lady first. The young man was a little puzzled and had no intention of asking for forgiveness, but he still knew that he had no other choice, and through clenched teeth, he asked the young lady for forgiveness. The prince looked at the young man with anger and asked if, when making an apology, one should not indicate what he is asking forgiveness for. Ariadne sighed heavily and said that she didn't need it at all. She looked closely at the young man who was still on the ground and said that she was consoled, with the hope that he had learned a lesson from what had happened. A moment later, she said that he could go. With the speed of lightning, the young man left their company. He cried out that he was very grateful to the prince. The young lady in turn looked sideways at the prince. She saw that he looked very sad. A moment later, she nudged him a little with a smile and asked why he was so sad. She smiled and said that only her sadness was appropriate here. The prince in turn sighed heavily, but did not answer the young lady. A moment later, he looked at her intently and said that she must answer him honestly. He looked at her very seriously and asked if she had been treated like this at home. The prince looked at the young lady intently and touched her tenderly. He said that it was not at all fitting for her to endure such a thing. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that she was amazing. She froze in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her in surprise and said that he hadn't removed the strand of hair that had been released on purpose. A moment later, the young lady laughed sheepishly. He looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was laughing. But still, the prince looked at the young lady with a soft smile, as he liked her radiant smile. Some time later, the cardinal asked everyone present for a moment of attention so that they could greet the main heroine of today's celebration, his daughter. A moment later, the young lady and her companion were perhaps walking into the hall. Everyone looked at the young people in surprise. They said that she was very beautiful, and the guy who was next to her was also not bad-looking. They wondered who he really was. The madam looked at the young lady with a grin as she realized who it was. She smiled and said that it seemed that she came accompanied by a prince. Isabella looked at her sister with fury, as she did not understand how she dared to act like that. She was furious because she knew that her sister sat at home all day, but she had already managed to seduce the prince somehow. A moment later, everyone present was informed that a messenger had arrived, with congratulations from His Majesty the King. The young people, in turn, froze in surprise, as they had not expected to hear anything like that at all. She looked closely at the prince and asked what was going on. The prince, in turn, was no less surprised than she was. He said that he had no idea what had happened. He said that he had not informed his mother and father that he had left the palace. A moment later, all those present bowed to the messenger from the palace, as did the young lady, while the prince stood in his place with his head held high. The young lady froze in shock. She did not expect to see the count in person. She looked at him with fury. She did not understand why he was in such a place. She did not know what he was planning. A moment later, he unfolded the document and told everyone present to listen carefully. He said that today the young lady is celebrating her debut in front of everyone, and she has previously received recognition for her services to the state, thanks to her unwavering faith in God. The king therefore congratulated her on her official debut and sent Count Cesare de Como as her partner. The prince was shocked by this. He did not expect anything like this. The young lady froze in surprise. On the spot, she was furious because she didn't want him to be her partner. She didn't expect this at all. In turn, the count was furious since, due to his mother's whim, he had to court the impudent girl. A moment later, he froze in surprise as he noticed that the young lady was accompanied by a prince. With the speed of lightning, his face changed as he realized that his mother's idea was not bad. He slowly walked closer to them and looked at the prince with a grin. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he had come here today on behalf of the king, and therefore he would offer formal greetings. A moment later, he looked at the prince with a satisfied smile and said that he would repeat once again that the king had ordered him to be his partner at the ball. He extended his hand to the young lady with a satisfied smile and said that she should come with him. The prince, in turn, looked sideways at the outstretched hand with fury. The young lady froze in surprise. She looked at him with fury since she did not want anything like that at all, but she did not answer. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that there was a strict royal order and she must obey it immediately. The prince saw that she was furious. He looked at his brother with rage. Then a moment later, his face changed, and looking at the young lady, he said with a soft smile that it was obvious that it was time for him to let her go. He smiled, and the young lady gently said that they could see each other later. Cesare looked at the young people with a satisfied grin. He liked what was happening. After some time, they danced leisurely. He looked closely at the young lady and thought that if he looked closely, she was quite a pretty girl when she was powdered and her hair done, and he also noticed that she had a very beautiful figure. He smiled and said that he was very pleased to meet her again. He said with a smile that he could not take back what he had said, and that from today on, he pledged to behave politely with her, calling her by name. Without looking at the young man, she told him to call her by her last name. He noticed that, unlike other girls, she had plenty of courage, but he understood perfectly well that the most important thing now was that she was the prince's girlfriend. He knew that if he deprived the prince of such a flower, it would be quite exciting. He looked at her intently and said with a soft smile that his soul was warmed by the hope that they would soon be able to become closer. A moment later, Isabella sauntered over to the prince, who stood watching intently as the young lady danced with his brother. With the speed of lightning, she approached the vase of flowers and quickly threw it on the ground. With a crash, it fell with the flowers and broke. The prince, in turn, did not have time to catch it, and everyone looked intently at the young people. They whispered in surprise as they realized that the prince had decided to invite the young lady to dance, but in his excitement, he had accidentally broken a flower vase. They said that it seemed that even the prince could not resist the lady's beauty. She looked at him with a satisfied smile and said that she dared to believe that he wanted to ask her to dance. He hesitated and looked at her in surprise and whispered that he didn't want to do this at all. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was all looking at them. Moments later, the young people were dancing in circles. She smiled and asked him if he was enjoying the event. He looked away from her and said that the festival was wonderful,